A walk to the edge of hell. The enormity of the World Trade Center disaster overwhelms rescue workers and relatives of the missing.
We're looking at those terrorist organizations who have the kind of capacity that would have been necessary to conduct the attack that we saw on the 11th. We haven't yet publicly identified the organization we believe was responsible. But when you look at the list of candidates, one resides in that region.
The United States narrows the list of suspects and seeks international support for retaliation.
We continue CNN's extensive coverage of America Under Attack. Hello, I'm Relitza Vasilova.
And I'm Jonathan Mann. In a few hours, a new dawn will rise in the United States on a national day of mourning declared by President George W. Bush. The president himself is to attend services in New York and Washington, while authorities searching for those behind Tuesday's attacks cast a wider net. At least 8 people were arrested at New York City's 2 major airports Thursday. They were taken into custody for immigration issues and for carrying false documents, including, in one case, a fake pilot's license. Authorities say 4 of the men had been challenged by airport officials before on Tuesday, the day hijackers commandeered and crashed 4 airliners. Now all are being questioned by FBI members of the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Meanwhile, the investigation has branched out overseas. U.S. and Philippine authorities staging a joint raid on a hotel outside the American embassy in Manila. Philippine President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo said the raid was connected to the attacks in the U.S., but gave no details.
Meanwhile, firefighters at the Pentagon had their hands full when a new fire flared briefly Thursday night. The fire was put out, and investigators resumed their search for the data recorders from the plane that plowed into the Pentagon Tuesday. On Thursday, search crews did recover the flight data recorder from the 4th crashed airliner, the Boeing 757, that went down in eastern Pennsylvania. And in New York, emergency workers sift through the tomb of twisted steel and concrete that was once the World Trade Center. New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani says the latest estimate of those missing now tops 4,700. No survivors were found Thursday as workers struggle to recover bodies. Loved ones gather near the scene of the tragedy and at hospitals, anxious for any word of those lost. Let's go now to New York, where CNN's Garrick Utley is keeping track of all the developments in this story. Hello, Garrick.
Good morning from New York, Relitza, and the thing we're tracking right now is the weather. Even here in our studio, we can hear thunder outside. There's been a lightning and thunderstorm moving through, and the impact of that on the city has been down there in lower Manhattan. You see the lights on the smoke, which is still rising from where the World Trade Center was. And that has, for the moment, interrupted the rescue operations. The workers, though, are certainly not going home. They're hanging in there. And when this storm passes through, they will continue their rescue operations. Of course, quite aside from the search and rescue down there, although we've put rescue in quotation marks because as of today, during the day, no survivors were recovered. There is the question of what happens now. That brings us to Osama bin Laden, the believed radical leader of the terrorist movement. And Secretary Powell said today that he is the top of the list, most wanted man in the world right now. But how do you go about, how does the Bush administration go about tracking him down and doing something about what he did last Tuesday morning, or is believed he did last Tuesday morning? The real questions are, who is he, Osama bin Laden? Where is he? And what is it that he really wants?
The who is the easiest answer. Osama bin Laden is 44, a millionaire born in Saudi Arabia who has used his wealth to finance terror to fulfill his crusade against the United States. The where of bin Laden is mainly Afghanistan, where he built his terrorist camps. The Taliban regime there, which has sheltered bin Laden, has imposed its version and vision of Islam on Afghanistan. Women can work only in health and education fields and have few rights. There is a ban on using the internet and on importing movies, musical instruments, and even playing cards. Western aid workers have been put on trial, charged with the crime of preaching Christianity. In March, the Taliban blew up a pair of 2,000-year-old statues of Buddha, despite international appeals to save the treasures that had no place in the purist Islamic society the Taliban are trying to build. If bin Laden and the Taliban have much in common, bin Laden is more engaged in backing fellow Arabs in their conflict with Israel, which is backed by the United States, and in attacking the leaders of his homeland, Saudi Arabia, whom he sees as the materialistic pawns of a militaristic United States, which has stationed its troops there. And so it is the United States that has become, in Osama bin Laden's eyes, the evil enemy that needs to be cut down in size and power. Literally, brutally cut down.
And there is certainly a dark irony about this whole story with Osama bin Laden. The fact is that several years ago in the past, the United States played a role in helping make him what he is. Not a radical terrorist, certainly, but bringing him to the power and the stature he has among the radical Arab movement and Muslim movement, simply because of the conflict in Afghanistan, when at that time he was serving the purpose against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, and he and bin Laden and many of his allies were supported by the West in their efforts against the Soviets. Well, now times have changed, the tables have turned, and one of the results is what we saw here last Tuesday. Let's go back now to Atlanta.
Garrick, just one question. What do New Yorkers want their government to do about this?
What do they want the government to do? Well, what do most Americans? I don't think we can really distinguish between New Yorkers and the mood across the country. They want the person who was behind this attack, or persons, plural, to be brought to justice. How do you define justice? Well, maybe you can arrest the guy, you bring him before a court. We've had those trials here, right here in New York City, against radicals who have carried out terrorist attacks, the bombing against the World Trade Center in 1993. That may not be possible. Maybe there's going to be direct military action, as happened after the U.S. embassies in East Africa were bombed, and that was linked to Osama bin Laden, and of course a number of cruise missiles started raining down on his camps. But I think people here, as across the nation, understand that there's a difference between what we as Americans, as individuals, would like to see happen, action taken, and whether that action is really going to lead to any concrete result that will diminish the possibility of further terrorism. It's a very, very difficult problem, and so far we have no indication as to what the timetable of this is going to be. How long does the Bush administration devote to the investigation before it takes some kind of military action? That's really the question that's hanging in the air, and we don't know whether we're talking about weeks or even months. And right now, we don't even know really how long the patience of the American public opinion is going to hold out on this. This is something that George Bush has to balance and weigh very carefully. Ralitza?
Garrick, thank you. John?
U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld is definitive in what he believes needs to be done. Speaking on CNN's Larry King Live, Rumsfeld said maintaining the U.S. way of life in the aftermath of the attacks will require a war. Quoting here, a major, long-range, broad-based, sustained effort.
I don't think of it as retaliation. I don't think of it as punishment. I think of it as self-defense. The United States of America has every right to defend itself, and that is what it is about. It is consciously saying that countries and entities and people who actively oppose the United States and damage our interests by acts of violence, acts of war, are our enemies, and they are people and organizations and entities and states that we have every right to defend ourselves against.
President Bush has not yet said how he intends to respond to Tuesday's attacks. For now, he is considering a request from Rumsfeld to call several thousand members of the reserves to active duty in the next few days. The last call-up was in January of 1991 for the Gulf War. John King reports the president is not taking any of the decisions before him lightly.
The president choked up as he discussed the enormity of the challenge ahead.
I think about the families, the children. I'm a loving guy, and I'm also someone, however, who's got a job to do, and I intend to do it.
2 days after the attacks, discussions with top security advisors include talk of retaliatory strikes, followed by a sustained international diplomatic and financial crackdown against suspected terrorists and their supporters.
Now's an opportunity to do generations a favor by coming together and whipping terrorism hunting it down, finding it, and holding them accountable. The nation must understand this is now the focus of my administration.
Sources say military planners are discussing options for retaliating against the lead suspect, Saudi terrorist Osama bin Laden. But one senior official said the administration was waiting to act because, quote, there might be not one but multiple organizations involved in this. Another served notice that when the administration does act, it will not be a one-time affair.
You don't do it with just a single military strike, no matter how dramatic. You don't do it with just military forces alone. You do it with the full resources of the U.S. government. It will be a campaign, not a single action.
The President and First Lady took time to visit some of those injured in the attack on the Pentagon. And Mr. Bush called Governor George Pataki and Mayor Rudy Giuliani to announce he will travel to New York on Friday to get a first-hand look at the worst of the devastation. But this interfered with the White House effort to project a reassuring image. The security perimeter around the White House suddenly expanded because of new concerns of a terrorist attack. Vice President Cheney left the White House and was rushed to the Camp David presidential retreat so that he and the president would not be at the same location. These new and ever-changing security precautions at the White House are the downside of what one of the president's closest advisors called an event that has transformed the country and what Mr. Bush himself labels the first war of the 21st century. John King, CNN, the White House.
For more on the president's reaction, we go now to White House correspondent Major Garrett. Major?
John, we have some news to bring you about the deal struck between the White House and congressional negotiators early this morning over a $40 billion supplemental spending bill to assist the efforts in New York and Virginia to recover and clean up after the terrorist attacks in both places. $40 billion is twice what the White House had requested from Congress, a clear sign of bipartisan support. $10 billion of that will be able to be released by the president immediately to aid those recovery and cleanup efforts. Another $10 billion can be released with 15 days' notice given to Congress, and $20 billion is being set aside in what congressional negotiators call a reserve fund that the Congress will obligate after being told to do so or asked to do so by the president. So $40 billion, a deal reached early this morning between the White House and members of Congress. Late Thursday on Larry King Live, House Speaker Dennis Hastert said that the Congress, Republican and Democrat, would unite behind the president, provide him resources not only to deal with recovery and cleanup, but also to draft and approve a resolution authorizing the use of force against any terrorist cells or organizations thought to have been responsible for the attacks on Tuesday. President Bush himself spent time on Thursday, dealing with the after effects of the Tuesday attacks, visiting those who are recovering at the George Washington Hospital Center and providing whatever comfort and aid he could to those recovering there at the hospital. Also, he spoke by telephone, as John King pointed out, with the governor of New York, Republican Governor George Pataki, and the mayor of New York City, Rudolph Giuliani. The president will fly to New York City later on today, Friday, to survey the damage from the air and also to go to the ground and see it up close. Before he does that, he will attend what is being described as a national prayer service on a National Day of Remembrance, the National Cathedral in Washington. Both efforts designed to bring the president to New York to thank and to shake the hands and give his support to those thousands of New York police and firefighters working in the recovery effort tirelessly, and also to lead the nation in a day of remembrance and a day of prayer. Jonathan?
Major, so the president will be traveling again. Let me ask you about his travels on Tuesday. You were with the press corps that was accompanying the president. What was it like that day?
It's an amazing day, Jonathan, an amazing day that began in the most ordinary of ways. The president woke up early. He went for a jog, even brought some reporters along. The president likes to jog. He runs at a pretty quick pace, about 7 minutes, 15 seconds per mile. He ran 3 miles, came back very rested, very fit, feeling very good. He even joked with reporters about how good it was to start the morning with a brisk and refreshing jog. Then we were all taken to Emma E. Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, where the president was going to begin reading a book to some of the students arrayed around him. Then he was going to make some remarks about education reform, the top domestic agenda item. But all of that was shattered by the first attack on the World Trade Center, Tower number 1, The president was notified of that just before he went in to read that book to the school children. And then as he was reading, his chief of staff, Andrew Card, came in, whispered in his ear the dreadful news about the second jet airliner crashing into Tower Number 2. The president's face darkened. Reporters asked him if he had known about any of this news. He cautioned them to be quiet. We would talk about it later, he said, clearly trying to protect the children from the devastating news they and the rest of America were beginning to see unfold before their very eyes. The president then quickly put together a statement telling the nation of an apparent terrorist attack. Then he was whisked away from Sarasota. We were told he was heading back to Washington, D.C., but as we know now, he himself and Air Force One was indeed a target, which forced him to fly first to Barksdale Air Force Base outside of Shreveport, Louisiana, then to Offutt Air Force Base near Omaha before returning to Washington. Jonathan.
Major Garrett, thanks very much. In the days since the attacks, Pakistan has come under immense pressure from the Bush administration to cooperate with the search for the perpetrators. The country is one of only 3 that recognize the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, where suspect Osama bin Laden is believed to be based. Tom Mantier joins us now live from Islamabad with the latest there. Tom?
John, because Pakistan is one of those 3 countries that do indeed recognize the Taliban, it is the location of a Taliban embassy. The embassy is here in Islamabad, and within the past hour, there was a press conference, a message coming outside of Afghanistan from Mullah Omar to the rest of the world, and it was read out by the Taliban's ambassador here to Pakistan. It was basically denial, denial, denial. Denial that Osama bin Laden was responsible for what happened in the United States, denial that pilots were coming from Afghanistan that were capable of doing what was done, and denial that Osama bin Laden has the means to conduct such a sophisticated operation. They went on to say that if the United States acts without evidence, that they are committing terrorism themselves, a reference to the possibility of some kind of military action against them. But they say they have taken away the phone, the fax, the email, the access to visitors of Osama bin Laden. Basically, he has been isolated within Afghanistan. He is basically under house arrest, if you will. He is basically held incommunicado, not allowed to communicate with the outside, controlled by the Taliban. That is, if you believe what they say, that they are controlling his movements, his meetings, his ability to communicate. They say they've taken away his satellite phone, his cell phone, his internet, his computers, basically holding him in isolation. Now, they have said in the past that if there is sufficient evidence provided, that they would put Osama bin Laden up before an Islamic court, the Islamic Supreme Court in Afghanistan. No word about any possible extradition. But basically, the statement coming out of the Taliban today was denial of involvement, saying that the United States doesn't have evidence because they know and control Osama bin Laden's movements and his activities inside Afghanistan. So it's really not really something new, but a reiteration of their previous position that we've been hearing here in Islamabad for the past couple of days, that Osama bin Laden, in their minds, was not the suspect that the United States sees him as being. John?
They seem to be making an important point, Tom, and I'd like to ask you to be absolutely clear on this. Are they telling us that Osama bin Laden is actually a prisoner of theirs now in Afghanistan? And if he's done nothing wrong, why would that be the case?
Well, you have to take their statement on faith, first of all. They don't use the word prisoner, they don't use the word house arrest, but when you take away people's ability to communicate, to move around freely, to have visitors, and control all of that access, you can translate that to a prisoner or house arrest or whatever you want to call it. But in fact, they have been controlling for some time now the access in to meet with him, the ability for him to communicate, the ability for communications to come in. Now, in this statement from Mullah Omar, they also said that they don't have the facilities to train pilots in Afghanistan. There's no ability to do that. The pilots, they say, did not come from Afghanistan, so they don't have any evidence, according to the Taliban, that the United States can pinpoint and direct the investigation towards Osama bin Laden. They say that his reputation is what they're really taking into account here, not the acts that were committed. Jonathan?
Tom Mantier, thanks very much. Relita?
A 3-minute silence will be held across Europe Friday. That's scheduled to begin in just about 3 hours from now. Britain has already said that as many as 100 of its citizens may have perished in the World Trade Center. Germany and Ireland are also reporting losses. European political editor Robin Oakley joins us now from London with more on how events in the U.S. are being viewed internationally. Robin.
Relitza, there's been a huge outpouring of grief and sympathy across Europe. And first of all, it is at the most basic of human levels. I went down yesterday to Grosvenor Square, where in front of the US Embassy, beneath the statue of Theodore Roosevelt, people have been pouring in to offer bouquets of flowers. They've put down dollar bills. There are candles burning, baseball caps. There was a picture of Brooklyn Bridge, all sorts of mementos in a huge outpouring of public sympathy. But that's been reflected too on a much more formal level. At Buckingham Palace yesterday, the Queen specially ordered that for the first time ever, the honoured ceremony of the changing of the guard should be altered, with the American national anthem being played before God Save the Queen. And today, the British Parliament is having an emergency session with a statement from Tony Blair, who's promised to stand shoulder to shoulder with the US. And it's the same across Europe. There have been church services in many capitals across Europe. There has been a vigil in Moscow. At the Frankfurt Motor Show, there was a 5-minute silence there. And all this outpouring of public sympathy is being reflected in very strong language of solidarity from the politicians.
Robin, what kind of support is Europe considering at this point? Is it considering military support?
Yes, I spoke yesterday, Relitsa, to the British Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw, and I questioned him directly on this. I said, does this standing shoulder to shoulder mean simply moral support, or is it military support? He was absolutely clear. NATO is making it absolutely clear. They've invoked Article 5 of the NATO Constitution, saying that what happened in New York and at the Pentagon is conceived as an attack on all 19 NATO members. There is going to be considerable discussion about what level of response they would like to see from the United States. There are worries, it has to be said, in some countries about just how high that level should be. Jack Straw was saying that it is important, too, that any targeted action is targeted on the right suspects. I think there are worries from parliamentarians in some countries that over indiscriminate action, perhaps with women and children suffering, might only cause the outbreak of further terrorism. So they want the action to be strictly targeted. And the words that were used on a British radio station this morning of Henry Kissinger, cool, relentless pursuit, were echoed by a number of British parliamentarians immediately afterwards. That's the kind of reaction they want to see. Relitsa.
Robin, thank you. John.
We'd like to take a moment to correct a report that appeared on CNN earlier. Based on information from multiple law enforcement sources, CNN reported that Adnan Bukhari and a brother Amir of Vero Beach, Florida, were suspected to be two of the pilots who crashed planes into the World Trade Center. Now CNN has learned that Adnan Bukhari is still in Florida, where he was questioned yesterday by the FBI. We are sorry for the misinformation. Through his attorney, Bukhari says he is not connected at all with this, that he is helping authorities, that any documents they found with his name mean his identity was stolen. He says Amir Bukhari, who he says is not his brother, died in a small plane crash last year. German police are investigating a possible connection with the hijackings. They searched 4 apartments in Hamburg, including the former home of one of the men suspected by U.S. authorities, Mohammed Atta. Atta and another suspect are believed to have received flight training in Florida. CNN's John Zarella has been looking into that.
Unfortunately, sadly enough,
Henry George feels pain, extreme frustration, and great regret.
I don't want to believe that what I did made him successful.
Last December 29th and 30th at his Opelaka Flight Training School, George gave 2 Middle Eastern men some basic lessons in a simulator on how to fly a jet aircraft. The 2 men were Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Shari. The FBI is now combing through apartments in South Florida, checking cars and mailboxes, all linked to Mohammed Atta. Law enforcement sources say Atta is a suspect in the attack, perhaps a pilot of one of the doomed jets. He was listed on the manifest of American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston. Marwan al-Shari, according to German authorities, was also aboard one of the hijacked planes. The story Atta and al-Shari gave their flight instructor was this.
They were on their way home, and they wanted the exposure to jet flying, or an introduction to jet flying. because they were hoping to get a job with their airline in their country.
George says they mentioned Egypt a couple of times, but generally during the 2 days, they didn't have much to say. No small talk.
They were low-key individuals, maybe even call them shy. There wasn't, they were not outspoken, opinionated type people.
In all, George says he spent 8 hours with the two men. They reserved their lessons with a credit card but paid in cash, $1,500. George says he wishes something about them had been suspicious.
He was using his own name. They provide you with credit card numbers. There was nothing that you would make you suspect that this individual was anything but above board.
George says they were just a couple of student pilots, and there was nothing special about their abilities.
What I can recollect from my memory is that we mostly did turns in a couple of approaches. I don't think we did any more than that.
What they didn't do, George says, was practice how to land. John Zarella, CNN, Miami.
Some airports across the United States have reopened for business, but passengers are facing some tougher security measures. Now, no knives are allowed, including plastic ones. No curbside or off-airport check-in. Only ticketed passengers are allowed past metal detectors. Also, security personnel have to meet higher standards, and more federal marshals will be on hand at large airports. Just after the attacks, many international flights scheduled to land in the U.S. were diverted to Canada. Most of those have now been allowed to fly to their original destinations. As Chris Burns reports, the first one arrived to emotional scenes at Los Angeles Airport.
Sighs and cries of relief that loved ones on an Alitalia flight from Milan to Los Angeles during the terror attacks weren't hijacked themselves. They were diverted to Calgary, Canada. Nunzia Bologna stayed calm, but her sister on the ground was terrified.
But we was scared when we heard the news. So thank you, God, everything is okay now.
The plane finally made it to Los Angeles International Airport Thursday, the first passenger flight here since the terror attacks. On Tuesday's flight, the passengers only knew they were being diverted until one of them called an operator on her cell phone. Her parents didn't know she switched to a direct flight from a stopover in New York.
They were more hysterical because they didn't hear anything until 2 o'clock in the afternoon and they thought I was dead.
Passengers say the final trip home from Canada started about midnight. Hours waiting to take off after lining up for hours of searches.
Through the handbags, and they were like every small things they were questioning, and they were looking for some weapons, I guess.
Squeezing out toothpaste tubes, things like
everything, even cameras, even everything with battery operated.
And it ended here about 12 hours later, an ordeal for thousands of passengers on countless diverted flights. Passengers at least grateful they're getting home safely. Chris Burns, CNN, Los Angeles.
That is, many families in New York City were still looking for their loved ones. Elizabeth Cohen has been speaking to some of them.
I haven't seen the American karma come together like this since the Vietnam War. Everybody feels the same way. Everybody has anger, but everybody has compassion. There is no script for what to say, and there's no script for how to feel.
My father was a window washer on Tower 2, the observation deck. He worked the rig outside. He last called us at 9:15 a.m. from the 105th floor, where he said there was 200 to 300 people just on that floor waiting for them to be told to head down. He said, don't panic to my mom. He said, don't get upset. Tell my kids I'm going to be okay, not to worry about it. I'm in God's hands.
Sadie called at about 5 minutes after 9. She said, oh God, please save me. She said she's trapped on the 106th floor. She was screaming that she can't get out. She's trapped, she can't get out. So she was yelling. She said, now, I don't know what to do. I'm coughing. The heat is coming. Please, I'm coming. I need water, I need water. And the phone dropped. We have checked the whole list in the armory over there. She's not on the dead list. She's not on the list on the hospital, so we are hoping for the best.
She was on the 93rd floor of the 2nd Trade Center,
We talked to her last after the first crash, and she called everyone to tell everybody that she was okay. And so we haven't heard anything since then, but we know she's there. So we're just, getting her face out there so everyone can find her. And we've covered all the hospitals and have her on the missing persons. And everyone's here to support us, so it's great. So you just have to find her. We know we will.
Tell us what happened over there, and if anybody got out, and if anyone made it, please call us. We're looking for her.
I'm looking for my son, Sal. He left home that morning, and he hasn't called back since then.
We're desperate. Everyone's desperate for information.
Our website, CNN.com, is launching an effort to help locate people who are missing in New York City. If you have a picture of a missing friend or relative, go to our website and follow the instructions there to send us the picture along with a contact number.
For those of you just joining us here, the latest development in the aftermath of the attacks. At least 8 people have been arrested at New York's Kennedy and LaGuardia airports as part of a security clampdown. Authorities say 4 of those taken into custody were seen at one of the airports on Tuesday, the same day as the attacks. Those detained are being held for carrying fake documentation and immigration issues. Authorities say one man was carrying a forged pilot's license. A nighttime thunderstorm in New York has added to the difficulties facing emergency crews searching the ruins of the World Trade Center. Authorities estimate more than 4,700 people are missing. Relatives have been queuing to register details of loved ones at a makeshift morgue. President Bush will visit the scene Friday to comfort relatives and thank rescue workers. And in another development, the White House and Congress have agreed on a $40 billion emergency aid package for New York and Virginia, where the Pentagon is located. Officials say up to 50,000 National Reserve troops could be called up to assist with the response to the attacks. Meanwhile, U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld told CNN's Larry King live on Thursday that sustaining America's way of life in the wake of the attacks will require, quote, a war, a major, long-range, broad-based, sustained effort. And for more now on how the Pentagon is responding, we're joined live by CNN's Mark Potter at the Defense Department. Mark.
Hello, Ralitza. Well, Pentagon officials say a decision has not been made yet, but President Bush is considering activating as many as 50,000 military reservists. We're told that they would be made available for the disaster recovery efforts. They would also be there to assist National Guard pilots who have already been put on standby or who have been flying combat air patrols. A Pentagon official cautions that this should not be seen by American citizens as a sign that a U.S. military response to the terrorist attacks is imminent. At a news briefing today, the Deputy Secretary of Defense said that when the U.S. does respond, it will be widespread and long-term.
I think one thing is clear is that you don't do it with just a single military strike, no matter how dramatic. You don't do it with just military forces alone. You do it with the full resources of the U.S. government. It will be a campaign, not a single action. And we're going to keep after these people and the people who support them until this stops.
Now, here in Washington, D.C. today, fighter jets could be seen flying past the U.S. Capitol and other national landmarks. The Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, said that combat air patrols are still being flown in the area between New York City and Washington, D.C. He also said fighter pilots are on a 15-minute strike alert at 26 bases around the country. Now, here at the Pentagon itself, this morning, workers continue to dig through the rubble as they have been doing 24 hours a day, looking for more victims and for the voice and data recorders, the so-called black boxes from the American Airlines 757 jet that slammed into the building here Tuesday morning. You can see the site. There was a fire here earlier, but it was put out in about 25 minutes by firefighters, and no one was hurt, and now work in the rubble has resumed. The county fire chief said earlier that officials heard what they believe were pinging sounds emitted by one of the black boxes, but so far there have been no reports that any of the boxes has been found. And finally, in conjunction with the National Day of Prayer and Remembrance, a call by President Bush, there will also be prayer services here at the Pentagon, where officials say their best estimate now is that around 190 people were killed here on Tuesday, and that includes the people who were aboard that American Airlines jet. Back to you.
Mark, if the Pentagon says that a military response is not imminent, what is the emphasis on at this point? Is it intelligence?
Yeah, it seems to be on intelligence, getting it right, knowing who to attack, laying the groundwork for that, and then planning the attack itself. We are told this is going to be a broad-based, multifaceted, long-term effort, not just one single attack like we have seen in the past, and again, no signs now that it is something that's going to happen right away. Back to you.
Mark, thank you. John.
If and when the U.S. does launch a retaliatory strike, military analysts say it's likely that Turkey would play a key role in the operation. Jana Raff talked with Turkey's Prime Minister about support for the United States.
This is one of the biggest U.S. air bases in the region. On Turkish territory leased by the U.S., it is, Turkish military sources here say, gearing up for a possible military strike. They say in the past 2 days, the U.S. has sent in more personnel, adding to the 7,000 troops it already has in southeastern Turkey. Movements in the town surrounding the base have been restricted. U.S. military officials won't comment on the new measures. Since the end of the Gulf War, U.S. planes have taken off from Incirlik to patrol and sometimes bomb northern Iraq, though the economy of southeastern Turkey relies on trade from Iraq. Also neighbor to Iran and Syria, Muslim Turkey is making clear its loyalties lie with the U.S.
I don't specify any country in our struggle against terrorism, and we will certainly support fully the Article 5 of NATO.
That article, invoked by NATO for the first time, treats the attack on the United States as an attack on all NATO members. Turkey's prime minister says that means Turkey would allow Incirlik to be used to strike whoever was behind the U.S. attack. There was military and emotional support here, as throughout Ankara Thursday, the Turkish star and crescent, the symbol of Islam, flew at half-staff alongside the stars and stripes in mourning for the dead. But in this country, a NATO member and a Muslim ally of the United States, the shockwaves are still being felt. Turkey's economy also staggered under the tragedy. Already in crisis, the Turkish lira fell further.
We have realized that we will be faced with additional economic problems while trying to deal with the economic crisis. We know that it's a global problem also.
Tourism was hit as cruise ships stopping in Istanbul kept their passengers on board. Like Americans around the globe, those here were told by their embassy to keep a low profile. Jana Raff, CNN, Ankara.
We now return to New York City for the latest on the recovery efforts and the search for survivors. Garrett Utley joins us with an update.
Well, thank you, Relitza. As we've been reporting, we wish we had something more or better to report. Thursday, no survivors were found or pulled from the rubble there in lower Manhattan. The work was continuing. A severe thunder shower has caused some interruptions, but it will keep going, of course, 24 hours a day. The workers working in 2 12-hour shifts. And as that happens, we await this return to normal life, much advertised, much awaited, which in a way did begin today. But what we really see now is that Manhattan, at least, the center of New York, is divided into 2 parts, that in the lower end where the disaster occurred, and above that in Central Park area, East Side, West Side, even up to Harlem. There's nothing physical that you can actually see that relates to the disaster. People are back in museums, they're in stores, they're strolling along the sidewalks, they're in Central Park, and yet the one telling difference is what you see and you sense in people's faces, in their eyes, in their body language, in snatches of conversation you overhear. That's an observation everybody is making and everybody is feeling, including our Maria Hinojosa.
What could be more normal than a mother and a son and a baseball in Central Park? But another mom with her baby looks listless, sad, and the great Central Park lawn empty. There are rollerbladers, but New Yorkers know that on a beautiful day the park would actually be packed. Now just a trickle. In Midtown, the traffic is back and running, and there are crowds in the streets, but these people were evacuated.
There was a bomb threat on 42nd Street, and for precaution reasons, they've asked us to leave.
There is foot traffic, lots of it, and people soaking in the good weather. But on the same street, tears.
We've been to all of the hospitals. We'll go back.
Yes, there is a sense that things are up and running in Midtown Manhattan, but everyone knows it's just not the same.
I'm military right here. I'm waiting for the call, baby.
It's unsettling to almost everyone.
The environment up here seems untouched by what happened. You know, there's a lot of tourists and people are still shopping, and you see people laughing and having fun, and it's kind of upsetting to me.
Yes, people are shopping again, but the big seller, photos of the towers.
New York will not be the same without those towers. They will not be the same.
Now the school buses are up and running, but so are the teens evacuated from a high school. New Yorkers are used to graffiti, but now they stop to read or write as others casually stroll by with face masks because of the lingering smoke. At the Plaza Hotel, a row of flags from around the world are now all U.S. flags, the red, white, and blue up and down Fifth Avenue. The tourists can get into the Metropolitan Museum now or see a show. They've got tickets, but also misgivings.
It's very difficult to go to a comedy when the nation is in grieving, but at the same time, our president and everyone else says to go about life as normally as we can.
As normally as we can? These days in New York or all around the country, it's hard to know just what normal is anymore. Maria Hinojosa, CNN, New York.
Maria was showing us those American flags up and down Fifth Avenue. Of course, that's been happening across the nation. There's been a tremendous surge in demand for flags, just as there's been a tremendous surge for human blood. And, of course, one of the things we've noticed these past couple of days is how the blood has been given in greater quantities than ever, and those flags have been displayed in greater quantities than ever. Relitza, back to you.
Garrick, this has been a day of false hopes dashed. We started the day with this good news that 5 firefighters had been rescued. It turned out not to be the case. Describe to us the emotions of this day.
Well, the emotions are mixed, as we saw in Maria Hinojosa's report right there. We're trying to get back to a normal rhythm of life, but you simply can't do it. There was that one couple, for example, she interviewed on the sidewalk. They were going to go to a comedy. Now, Broadway has lots of comedies, lots of tragedies, too, playing as theater plays. And you probably ordered those tickets a long time ago. You've been looking forward to this great occasion. Tonight's the night. It's there. What do? Not go? No, you go. How do you laugh? Can you laugh? I don't know how I would react at a comedy, even if I were able to get tickets to The Producers, which is sold out for the next 2 years and is one of the great comedies of all time on Broadway. So I think people sitting in the theaters, who were sitting in the theaters on Thursday night and will be there on Friday night too, had very mixed emotions. And that's the drama, indeed, that's the theater of life we're going through right now in New York. Relitza?
Garrick, thank you.
The disaster at the World Trade Center raises questions about the structural integrity of skyscrapers. David George explores that technology.
It was the attack that was never supposed to happen. And when it did, what happened next happened just like it was supposed to.
The building rocked like you were on a ship. And it swayed back and forth a couple of times.
The World Trade Center's North Tower shook and swayed, but thanks to a design concept engineers call redundancy, did not fall, not right away.
If the load carrying capability is disturbed or destroyed in one area, within reason, it should be able to, the structure should be able to transfer the load from that point and carry it down to the foundation using a different path.
That's what happened at the World Trade Center. After the impact, the North Tower stood for more than an hour, long enough for hundreds, perhaps thousands, to escape. The collapse, when it came, was caused by fire.
The fire was very, very intense and burned for a long time. The fire weakened that portion of the structure which remained after the impact. It was weakened by the fire to the point where it could no longer sustain the load.
When the World Trade Center towers did fall, they pancaked onto themselves, minimizing damage to adjacent structures, just like the center's designers had intended should disaster ever strike. In the 90s, after Oklahoma City, many government buildings were retrofitted to better withstand bomb blasts. But when an airliner hit the heavily reinforced Pentagon, the seat of the nation's military leadership didn't stand a chance.
A large jet full of fuel hitting a structure is about as severe as it gets.
In the days after the World Trade Center tragedy, Georgia Tech's Barry Goodnow suggested it would be technically possible, but too expensive, to design a totally disaster-proof building, unless, he said, the building were built underground. David George, CNN.
The attacks in the U.S. have taken a heavy financial toll, forcing the closure of the New York Stock Exchange and some other markets. For the latest, we turn to CNN's Richard Quest in London. Richard.
Indeed, Relitza. But there was some good cheer to the extent that the Chicago bond market managed to reopen on Thursday. It was a shortened session, and we saw, of course, the price of US Treasuries jump. Monday will be the big day. That's when US stock markets, including the New York Stock Exchange and the Nasdaq, they're due to reopen after the 4-day closure. Exchange officials plan to test the trading systems over the weekend. The new business day has just started here in Europe. I believe Liz George is at the London Stock Exchange to bring us up to date as how early indications. Liz?
Richard, thanks very much indeed. I'll show you the figures that our markets are actually trading at, but I want to add a note of caution here, really. No one's taking too much notice at the moment of what's happening on these indices. They're jumping around all over the place. Really, there's very, very light trade going through there. There's an awful lot of wanting to wait and see, waiting for the US markets to open. There's a big feeling of awareness, really, that even when those US markets do open, we're going to have probably around about 4 weeks of enormous volatility before things begin to settle down. So people are very, very aware that actually, although these figures are coming out, trades are being done, really prices are being set at wild levels at the moment. So it's very, very light trading. There's an awful lot of movement in these markets, wavering around in this very thin trade. So at the moment, the FTSE is up 0.39%, the DAX is up 0.86%, and in France, the CAC 40 is up 1.24%. Richard.
Liz George at the London Stock Exchange. A quick reminder that there were some gains in Asia in the overnight trade in both Tokyo and Hong Kong. Now, as rescuers continued the grim task of sifting through the rubble, it's becoming increasingly clear the size and scale of the damage. Not only from the destruction to the World Trade Centers, but to the surrounding buildings and businesses. The insurance industry believes that the cost of repairing the physical damage could be well in excess of $20 billion. Andy Cook is the editor of Insurance Times. He joins me now for a closer look at the long-term impact of the attack. Andy, it's unsavoury, but we must, to some extent, the size and scale in relation to the insurance industry.
Well, we've been talking to actuaries who are the accountants of the insurance industry, and they're saying that it could be up to 100 billion, although the lower limit is sort of 50 to 20. But, you know, the 100 billion is certainly a possibility.
And this isn't just, of course, for the buildings. It's for the tremendous loss of life. It's for the loss of business. Give me an idea of how far and wide this goes.
Well, it starts with the public liability of, say, the World Trade Center itself and the injuries and effects on the businesses around that. But it goes as far as UK, Europe, businessmen in Europe trying to fly to America. They're going to put claims in against their travel insurers because they haven't been able to go across. And the ripples just, you know, go ever further.
At the end of the day, when blame is finally laid, and besides the blame, I mean, besides the terrorists who committed the act, we're talking about where the insurance blame lies, it's possible that this will all end up with either the airlines, the airports, or the security companies. Is that right?
That's right. The chain of events will be that the companies within, say, the World Trade Center will claim against the World Trade Center itself. The World Trade Center may then claim against the airlines, and the airlines then after may claim against the airports for letting the hijackers onto the planes.
Can the insurance industry withstand these vast sort of losses?
Yes, the sums we're talking about are being shared around many, many companies. The sort of structure of it is that you have an insurer, and underneath that, the insurer then gets its policies reinsured, and the reinsurers themselves get reinsured. So we're actually talking about lots and lots of companies sharing small packets of costs.
In London, Lloyd's of London rang the Luton bell, which of course is rung at times of great tragedy. This is often thought of as the centre of the insurance world, but also Zurich as well. The European companies there will bear a lot of the financial loss.
Some of the biggest companies to take a loss in this will be from Central Europe. People like Zurich Re, Swiss Re, Munich Re. They're the companies that underpin the whole industry.
Andy Cook, many thanks indeed. That's the way the business world looks for the moment. From London, Relitza is in Atlanta for the rest of the news. Relitza.
Richard, thank you. Looking ahead, Friday is an official day of mourning in the United States and Europe. President Bush is planning to visit New York for a first-hand look at the devastation. The FBI is questioning 8 people arrested at New York's 2 major airports in a security crackdown. Sources say 4 of them also were challenged at one of the airports on the day of the attacks. Thursday, they were taken into custody for carrying fake documentation, including one suspect carrying a phony pilot's license. What happened on Tuesday has brought about acts of extraordinary kindness from Main Street to Wall Street. GE, Cisco, Microsoft, and AT&T are just a few of the giant names that have pledged millions of dollars to the rescue operations. It's all part of an effort that's seen business, big and small, play its part. Susan Lisovich has more.
New York's financial district remains shut down, but they are already back in business on this ping pong table 2 miles north. Employees of the consulting firm Casina can't get to their lower Manhattan offices because the area is sealed off, but they're working in a makeshift office donated by a local business.
Obviously, finding space is amazing. 2 days later, we have a new phone number and some space to get back and continue doing what we need to do.
The Silicon Alley Reporter is offering 14,000 square Midtown office space free to businesses left homeless by Tuesday's terrorist attack. Another firm, Bluefly.com, is donating 9,000 square feet of space.
Domino's Pizza offered to send pizzas up for the new tenants, and we've had people who have volunteered engineering services and computer services and furniture rentals. So it's been pretty surprising, and we're obviously grateful for the response that's followed on from this.
We can give you any amount of voicemail.
Okay. Oh, really?
Yeah. The CEO of the Silicon Alley Reporter says it is the right thing to do.
We have to realize that one of the reasons that people did this was to screw up our economy. It wasn't just to psychologically scar us, to kill people. They want to shut down the economy. And these companies, mid-sized companies, small-sized companies, are the bulk of our economy. And they're going to go out of business. People are going to lose their jobs.
For those helping out in this time of crisis, it is goodwill and good business. Susan Lisovich, CNN Financial News, New York.
30 years ago, building the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center was a proud achievement for thousands of workers. Taking it apart, piece by shattered piece, is a sad affair. But as correspondent John Voss and photographer Tim Wall discovered, hard work is hard work.
Never in my wildest imagination did I think this building was going to come down. I really believed in my heart that we were here to save people, not to carry our brothers out.
I mean, I worked on 7 World Trade. I was one of the engineers when we built it. And now here I am, taking it down.
Mark, on front of it, red spray paint.
Well, we're working on 24-hour shifts. 24 on, 24 off.
It can't be described. It can't be described. It can't be. It's just, it's unbelievable.
Our extensive coverage of America under attack continues. For now, I'm Jonathan Mann.
And I'm Relitza Vasilova. We leave you now with the latest pictures that we received on the remarkable devastation and the extent of the devastation in Manhattan. These pictures shot by a structural engineer.
Tuesday's terror attack on America has Washington and its allies focused on targeting those who are responsible.
We will go after that group, that network, and those who have harbored, supported, and aided that network to rip the network up.
For many Americans, the focus remains on those who lost their lives and those who are still missing. You're watching CNN's continuing coverage of America Under Attack, the search for answers. I'm Relitza Vasileva, the CNN Center.
And I'm Jonathan Mann. Americans are beginning a national day of remembrance for the victims of the terror attacks. For many, the enormity of the tragedy is still incomprehensible, the scope of the disaster still immeasurable. CNN has obtained remarkable pictures of the aftermath of the attack in Lower Manhattan. This home video is shot from inside the World Financial Center complex, which is next to what remains of the World Trade Center. One observer described the area as the view from hell. Outside Washington, firefighters were back at work at the Pentagon overnight. Authorities say it took about 25 minutes to knock down the new flames that began racing up one side of the gash in the building's walls. Rescuers are still searching for the voice and data recorders of the plane that crashed into the Pentagon Tuesday.
A security crackdown at 2 of New York City's major airports has resulted in at least 8 arrests. All were booked as passengers on flights from Kennedy or LaGuardia airports on Thursday. Law enforcement sources tell CNN the group includes at least 4 people who were seen at one of the airports on the day of the attacks. They say the 4 were taken into custody for carrying fake documentation, including one man who was posing as a pilot. The sources say immigration issues also played a role in their arrests, but they did not elaborate. They say all had booked open-ended tickets with no return date, and that raised a red flag. Kennedy, LaGuardia, and New York airports were all shut down late Thursday as part of a security ground stop. Incoming flights were allowed to land, but takeoffs have been halted. In a separate development, Philippine President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo says the Philippines and the United States have conducted a raid at a hotel in Manila in connection with the terrorist attacks.
There was a joint operation between the Philippine police and U.S. operatives, including Bayview Hotel, which is just in front of the U.S. Embassy, with regard to some suspected links between what happened in the U.S. and some of the connections that might have been in the Philippines.
Back in Washington, members of Congress were told to evacuate the U.S. Capitol late Thursday. A suspicious package was the cause. Lawmakers were allowed back in less than an hour to get on with their business. And just hours after the scare, the White House and Congress agreed on a $40 billion emergency aid package. The amount is twice the White House had originally requested.
Investigators have found the data recorder from United Flight 93. That's the hijacked airliner that crashed in western Pennsylvania Tuesday. The data recorder was discovered in a crater left when the plane slammed into the ground. It has now been sent to the National Transportation Safety Board in Washington for analysis. Authorities say it may provide vital information on that thwarted hijacking. Most U.S. airports resumed operations Thursday under a set of stringent new security measures. By afternoon, more than 1,200 domestic flights were flying above the U.S. Flights from overseas, though, remained banned. There was one exception, however. Airlines that had been diverted to Canada after Tuesday's attacks were allowed to bring their passengers back to U.S. soil.
Horror and shock gripped the U.S. public after Tuesday's attacks, which killed people from around the globe. Now Americans of many faiths will join President Bush today in a national day of prayer and remembrance for the victims. The president plans to visit the site of the destruction in Manhattan after attending a church service in Washington.
The president will attend a church service here at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and the president is asking all Americans at their lunch hours to go and attend a church, a synagogue, a mosque, a place of their own choosing for worship, to say a prayer in assistance to the families and the victims of this horrible incident.
In London, Queen Elizabeth II and Prime Minister Tony Blair will attend a service at St. Paul's Cathedral. A memorial service for the dead is also taking place at St. Mary's Cathedral in Dublin. Prime Minister Bertie Ahern will attend. In Berlin, a vigil will be held at the Brandenburg Gate, and France will observe a moment of silence for the victims. Meanwhile, in New York, inclement weather is slowing rescue operations. However, with more than 4,700 still missing, the work goes on. Garrick Utley joins us live from New York with the latest. Garrick.
Yes, despite the thunderstorm, electrical storms, the lightning strikes, which has interrupted the work, the workers are not disappearing, and it is expected to resume as soon as possible there. As we've been reporting, Relitza, and as we all know, We're looking now at Lower Manhattan. There you can see the lights at the work site and some of the plume of smoke rising there. As we know, what we're looking at is the financial heart of the world, of the world economy. And indeed, the fact that the stock exchanges down there in the Wall Street area have been closed this week, will not reopen to Monday, has had a profound impact on sort of financial psychology worldwide. And I thought it might be interesting to take a moment to recall how Wall Street and that financial heart of the world economy came to be. It was in the late 1700s that some American entrepreneurs, investors in the young America of that time, late 1700s, wanted a place to get together and buy and sell shares in these young fledgling companies that would grow and make the American economy what it was. But there were no stock exchanges, so where did they meet? Well, they met each day under a buttonwood tree, and there informally they bought and sold shares, little slips of paper. Well, over the years, that grew. Stock exchanges were built. They've had their ups and downs. And in many ways, that whole process culminated at the end of the 20th century, the construction of two 110-story twin towers called the World Trade Center. Stop and think about that for a moment. It took more than 200 years to culminate with those two towers that shadowed over Wall Street, in the heart of the financial capital of the world. It took 1 hour last Tuesday to bring them down. Well, just before that thunderstorm struck this evening, that work site where the towers stood was full of activity. And our Alessio Vinci, who's been monitoring the rescue effort there, offered us this report.
500 yards behind me, the rescue operation is continuing. It is now more than 2 days that the rescue workers are sifting through the debris and trying to find if more people or any people can be found alive underneath there. The workers there is a big security concern for the rescue workers. Earlier today, some of the workers were asked to leave an area around the building, as it appears that this building was shifting. Of course, among the many thousands of people who are still missing, there are still 300 firefighters, 30 police officers, and 30 Port Authority police, and certainly the people there who are trying to sift through the debris, they are first and foremost concerned with their security. One of the buildings was also evacuated. As you can see, there is a lot of activity here. Ambulances going in. There is a long line of trucks going inside and trying to take some of the debris. We understand more than 6,000 tons of debris have been removed so far. The Staten Island, they've been brought to Staten Island. The FBI is going through it. The latest official count is 184 sets of human remains found so far. 47 are entire bodies, and only 35 of them have been identified. The number of missing people, more than 4,700. Among them, of course, the Americans who were working inside the World Trade Center, but also many foreigners, many people from Germany, from Japan, from Britain. That number again, 4,700, more than 4,700 missing. I'm Alessio Vinci, CNN, reporting from Manhattan.
And throughout Manhattan, of course, as life returns to more or less normality these days, there's always this question about the New York temperament. New Yorkers being seen as being obnoxious, obstreperous, very difficult. Are we a different breed? Well, one reason perhaps that image exists is because people in New York have to live differently than people across the nation. There are no backyards here. There's really no space. People here, 7 million of them, live close to one another. Many of them live in sort of dormitory living in these high-rising apartment buildings. Maybe that explains some of this different temperament. We thought it'd be interesting to get a different perspective of the New Yorker, not from somebody who lives here, but from an out-of-towner. Our Bruce Burkhardt, who works for CNN and reports for CNN from Atlanta. Here's his report.
As devastating as this was, as unimaginably sad as this was, as much as the worst-case scenario almost looks good compared to this, there's something else that has emerged from the rubble. Something that is oddly reassuring to a non-New Yorker like myself who's ventured into this city at such a time. Something that proves New York is much more than its distinctive, though now altered, skyline. Pissed off. It is an attitude, best described as, well, yeah, that kind of describes it, but not completely. It is not a place that likes to show off its soft underbelly.
We hurt, we have pain, and we bleed. We tend to be able to handle adversity better than the average person in the rest of the country.
Are you surprised by New Yorkers and how they deal with this thing?
No, I don't think so, because they've always done this.
And in America, where the physical landscape has changed dramatically in the last 50 years with its strip malls and developments, walking in New York is like strolling through a 1950s black and white movie. Even now, an enduring sameness, the skyscrapers, the hustle-bustle, the sea of yellow cabs, and that why I oughta pound you attitude.
I hope we strike back, and I hope we strike back hard.
But despite the tough words and a superficial return to normality, people lining up for Broadway tickets, friends meeting for coffee just blocks from Ground Zero, despite all this, normality is still a long way off.
I think the anger is going to come. But right now, everybody you speak to is just sad.
Sadness, almost debilitating sadness, but with it, something uniquely New York, a certain defiance.
Tell Andy and Betty in Indiana, Jen and Joey are fine.
We will. Bruce Burkhardt, CNN, New York.
Of course, the old saying is that New York is a great place to visit, but I never would want to live there. And yet, look at the figures. Others have different views because, according to the most recent census of the United States and the city of New York, the population in this town has actually gone up. Relitza?
Garrick, thank you. John?
There is defiance in New York, and we've just seen it, but there's also sorrow, the wrenching uncertainty of what's happened to so many people. It's brought hundreds of others onto the streets of New York, clutching photos of the missing. Relatives and friends say they're also trying to hang on to hope.
Sadie called at about 5 minutes after 9. She said, "Oh God, please save me." She said she's trapped on the 106th floor. She was screaming that she can't get out. She's trapped, she can't get out. So she was yelling. She said, "Now, I don't know what to do. I'm coughing. The heat is coming. Please, I'm coming. I need water, I need water." And the phone dropped.
We've been hearing lots of good stories about people making it off of really high floors, so we just know that she's one of them, and we just have to figure out where she is.
The first phone call that he made to her was that they are evacuating, and we were all very happy because we were all kind of on the phone, my whole family and my sister. We were all like, oh my God, what happened? Because I work downtown. And then they said they were evacuating. We were all happy. Go, 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 said my sister, go. And then he called again and said, oh, you know what, everything's fine, don't worry. He was trying to calm her down. Stay calm, I love you so much. Don't worry about me, I'll be okay. And then they hung up, and then as soon as about 50 seconds later, the other airplane hit. We saw it on the news.
Well, it's really frustrating because you just want to go in there and start tearing things out, ripping them sheet metal. The sheet metal workers are doing it, the steel workers are in there, the pipe fitters, everybody, engineers, Con Ed, I mean, just everybody. And it's frustrating because you have to stop. You hear whistles, signals for you to stop because they think they hear a sound, a movement. They'll stop. I mean, total silence. And, and it might be false alarm, or if it is, you have to, people are so buried down there, you have no idea.
Our website, CNN.com, is launching an effort to help locate people who are missing in New York. If you have a picture of a missing friend or relative, go to our website and follow the instructions there. Send us the picture along with a contact number.
There's been tough talk from U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. He describes Tuesday's attack as an assault on the American way of life. The Defense Secretary has warned that protecting the country from terrorists will require, quote, a war and a sustained effort. While U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell has named the Saudi-born Osama bin Laden as a prime suspect, Rumsfeld has been more circumspect on that score, but he warns that any action the U.S. takes against any perpetrators would be justified.
I don't think of it as retaliation. I don't think of it as punishment. I think of it as self-defense. The United States of America has every right to defend itself. And that is what it is about. It is consciously saying that countries and entities and people who actively oppose the United States and damage our interests by acts of violence, acts of war, are our enemies. And they are people and organizations and entities and states that we have every right to defend ourselves against.
Pakistan is asking the United States for time to consider a list of U.S. demands. The United States says it needs Pakistan to help find those responsible for the terrorist attacks. Our State Department correspondent Andrea Koppel has details.
Tightening the diplomatic screws on Pakistan's president, the Bush administration presented a list of specific steps it says Pakistan must take. Among them, to share information on what it knows about Tuesday's attacks and Osama bin Laden's terrorist network, to close the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan and cut off fuel shipments, and eventually to provide the United States with use of Pakistani airspace if needed.
We haven't yet publicly identified the organization we believe was responsible. But when you look at the list of candidates, one resides in that region.
Later, when pressed by reporters,
when you spoke of a candidate who resides in that region, were you speaking of Osama bin Laden?
Yes.
For the first time, Powell saying publicly what many have said privately, that bin Laden's network, based in Afghanistan, is a prime suspect. And as Afghanistan's neighbor and longtime supporter, Pakistan could play a critical role in finding bin Laden and shutting down his terrorist training camps for good. Following another full day of intense meetings and conversations between U.S. and Pakistani officials, President Musharraf assured the Bush administration of Pakistan's unstinted cooperation in the fight against terrorism. He said Pakistan is ready to commit all of its resources to locate and punish those responsible for the attacks in New York and Washington.
President Musharraf is in a difficult position. He has aided the Taliban for a number of years. But also he needs the United States very badly right now. We are improving our relations with India. He can't afford, I think, to antagonize the United States.
State Department officials say early indications from Pakistan are, quote, very positive. Still, Secretary Powell acknowledged with economic sanctions in place, the U.S. has very little leverage to turn up the heat. But he says the U.S. could make life a lot easier in Pakistan if its government cooperates. Andrea Koppel, CNN, at the State Department.
And Tom Mantier joins us now live from Islamabad. Tom, what has been the domestic reaction in Pakistan to President Musharraf's support for the U.S.?
Relita, we may be able to judge that in about 10 minutes. At 3 mosques across Islamabad, there are going to be prayers said for the American victims of this tragedy. So the public will have their chance to speak out. But as Andrea was saying in her piece, it is a very difficult situation that the Pakistani president finds himself in, because there are going to be domestic ramifications if indeed Pakistan cooperates with the United States in any type of military action in Afghanistan. The streets may be set alight here with protesters. And you have to look at where the Pakistani president comes from. He comes from the military side, not the political side, so he doesn't have any real political support as a politician might have. have because he's really gone out to clean up politics in Pakistan, so he really can't count on them. There are divisions within the military as far as support for the Taliban is concerned, so he's really in a very tight spot. But when you look at the economy of Pakistan, which is in a shambles right now, with Musharraf also going to the World Bank and others trying to seek loans to improve the economic situation here, that could be in jeopardy if he goes against the United States and swims upstream on this. So there is subtle pressure that is coming in the front door and not so subtle pressure to cooperate with the U.S. in its efforts to gather intelligence on Osama bin Laden and provide even access to the airspace if there was indeed a military strike against targets in Afghanistan. So he's really in a tough spot here politically and militarily. So he's really walking a very fine line. He has said unstinted support. What everyone is waiting to see is if push comes to shove, what unstinted really means. Ralitza?
And Tom, what about pressures from religious groups?
It is those religious groups that really make up the big problem domestically that he's going to have. If there are people out in the streets, as they were the last time there was an attack against Afghanistan, making demonstrations and burning flags, if this was a long, sustained campaign, air campaign against Afghanistan, there would be a long campaign of terror on the streets of places like Islamabad and Karachi and Lahore and elsewhere in Pakistan. So there is a real domestic problem for the government here if they side with the United States. If they don't side with the United States, the problems, though, may be even bigger.
Tom, thank you.
Whatever the stakes in Pakistan or elsewhere, for many Americans, the shock from Tuesday's attacks has given way to anger and cries for revenge, many directed against Osama bin Laden. U.S. officials say more than one terrorist group may have been involved in the attacks, though, and as CNN's David Ensor reports, getting at bin Laden may prove to be a very difficult task.
The nation is angry about thousands of innocent deaths. U.S. officials say the evidence so far points to Osama bin Laden's group, and the Bush administration is talking tough.
We will go after that group, that network, and those who have harbored, supported, and aided that network to rip the network up. And when we're through with that network, we will continue with a global assault against terrorism in general.
But if it is bin Laden, how to get at him and his top lieutenants? Some argue for giving Afghanistan's Taliban government an ultimatum. Turn him over or else.
We know where your ministries are. We know where your houses are. We're simply going to obliterate them from the face of the planet.
Bouncing that rubble with a lot of B-52 loads of bombs, I don't think is going to change Afghanistan all that much.
No, say most analysts in and out of government. If you want to roll up bin Laden and al-Qaeda, it is going to take more than bombs. It will take ground troops.
In order for us to preserve America and our way of life, we're going to have to sacrifice American treasure and, unfortunately, in some cases, perhaps some American blood.
It is not just a question of grabbing or killing one man or even 20. There are a dozen or more training camps, U.S. intelligence says, producing more terrorists dedicated to killing Americans.
Revenge alone is not an answer. There has to be a complete eradication and elimination of all the training camps.
And much of bin Laden's base of support is in neighboring Pakistan, through which money from around the Arab world is funneled to the al-Qaeda coffers. It is a treacherous and dangerous area indeed.
If you start moving in ground troops and you're willing to occupy countries for long periods of time, you do change things rather significantly for terrorists. I'm not sure this country is ready to do that, even if it does have a fit of passion right now, and it may or may not make sense for the U.S. to do that in its larger interests.
Bottom line, U.S. forces might be able to get bin Laden, but that alone would not stop the terror. Administration officials saying they will do nothing precipitous, knowing this one is going to be very, very difficult. David Ensor, CNN, Washington.
Who to punish and how? We're joined now from London by Fred Halliday, a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics and a specialist on the region. Thanks so much for talking with us. The talk here is Osama bin Laden and Afghanistan. Does it make sense to punish Afghanistan if indeed he is the man behind these attacks?
It certainly makes sense to punish those who have trained and supported Osama bin Laden's organization over many years. We don't know the full details of the training that went into this mission, but if, as it appears, the pilots who carried out the suicide missions in Washington, New York, were actually trained on albeit old, but nevertheless jets, passenger jets that were left behind in Afghanistan, that would be very significant. But overall, he cannot operate in Afghanistan without the say-so of the Taliban government. And for all that they'll say, oh, he's just a guest, or things in Afghanistan are very fragmented, they have responsibility, not just under international law, but in practice. You and I couldn't go there and set up an organization. We'd be dead in 2 minutes. So it is quite an effective system of rule, and they are responsible. The problem about punishing Afghanistan as a country is it's taken more punishment than any other country in the world in the last 20 years. Economically, in terms of refugees, it is a devastated country. And that, of course, is something that has to be balanced against the desire to punish those who supported bin Laden. But I have to add, the Taliban themselves have a patron, and the patron is Pakistan. In effect, that is a client government of Pakistan. They provide many of its security and military personnel. They set them up in business. They may not be responsible for everything the Taliban do, but the trail of responsibility has to go to Pakistan as well as to Afghanistan. What that means for U.S. diplomacy is for others to say.
Let me ask you, to your mind, what is going through the minds of the leadership of the Taliban right now? Do they want to tough this one out? Do they want to make a deal? What do you think they're saying in Kandahar and Kabul right now?
Well, remember that the Sudanese government supported some terrorist actions on a much lower level years ago, and then in the end they did a kind of a split. They let one group go, Osama bin Laden go, and sent him to Afghanistan, and they handed over another one, Carlos the Jackal, from the Sudan. Now, the Taliban, I think, are thinking also they don't want to go down the tube entirely, but they support military actions against neighboring states, including, I would stress, Iran, who they detest. They've supported military actions in Central Asia, and they support this more militant view of Islamic fundamentalism as being something which is at war with the West. It's clear in their rhetoric, it's true in their actions. Secondly, they must have helped prepare this operation. And if it goes well for them, and if it goes well for Osama bin Laden, the consequence will be very simple but very important. It's a recruiting measure, a very gruesome, cruel, but calculated recruiting measure. They're not going to defeat the United States. They don't think for a minute that they can do that. It's not like Vietnam fighting the US in the 70s. They are carrying out these actions, they're what the anarchists call propaganda of the deed, to punish the enemy, but also to recruit. On a smaller scale, that was the purpose behind the destruction of the Buddhist statues last March. It was to say to radical Muslims, we're standing up to these people, we're not going to take any notice. However, if the cost looks like it's going to be too high, they could do anything, and they could indeed even surrender bin Laden or say he'd had a car accident.
How, in theory, would the United States, how would the West make Afghanistan pay if Afghanistan's already fought itself into rubble through long years of civil war, if the government is insensitive to the poverty and suffering its people already feel? What can be done?
Well, I think there are two things that can be done, and I know that every politician and diplomat in the world is thinking of this. I'm not saying anything original. On the one hand, those in the Taliban leadership and in the associated special services of Pakistan who were associated with this, as well as Osama bin Laden, can be attacked, can be arrested, can be dealt with in whatever way is possible. I'm not sure whether the United States wants to bring them back in a Noriega-like way and put them in a Florida jail, or whether they would be happy to have a bloody battle there. But it's to destroy the leadership who were responsible in the Qaeda organization of bin Laden, in the Taliban, and in Pakistan for this. That's number one. It has to be counterbalanced by political limits for the population of Afghanistan, for whom we have a responsibility anyway, since the West helped create the mess there, in fact, largely helped create the mess there in recent years. But secondly, there have to be countervailing measures to show that this is not a war with the third world or the Islamic world. And I would say that there has to be more diplomatic activity to address the other issues that have fueled this. That goes from Kashmir in the east through to the Gulf problems, through to the Palestine question. In other words, there has to be not just military containment of what's done, but countervailing long-term diplomatic activity.
Professor Halliday, I'm going to jump in because you're making a crucial point here. U.S. officials have been making it known, in fact, that their war on terrorism is not just a war against Osama bin Laden. The U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell had this to say just a short time ago.
With the severity of this tragedy in Washington and New York against America, we now have to use this tragedy and respond to those and take care of those who are responsible for it. But at the same time, we should see this in a broader sense, that this is a horrible blight on the civilized world. And so we will also be focusing on other organizations, terrorist organizations, who go after us, our citizens, our interests, and allies.
Other organizations that go against us and our citizens and our allies. Read between the lines for us. How many different groups does the Secretary of State, does the United States want to take on now?
Well, in one sense, Secretary of State Powell and also President Bush himself have set themselves an impossible task. There will not be, in the Middle East or anywhere else, in Ireland or in Colombia or in Sri Lanka or 20 other places we could mention, there will not be an end to irregular forms of violence in the foreseeable future. Terrorism, in that sense, cannot be defeated or eradicated. Terrorism can be contained. And secondly, some of the causes of it can be addressed. But you've seen, even in a relatively contained situation like Ireland, where you've got a few thousand deaths over 20 years, it's been very, very difficult to eradicate the issue entirely. But you can contain it. But that there may be other organizations close to Al-Qaeda, yes. Then we have the other problem, which is every use of violence by a people or a group who claim oppression or who are oppressed violence, is it terrorism? That's a much more difficult issue. And I think, for example, I don't think most people in the U.S. would regard people fighting for the independence of Tibet as terrorists, but some would. I think there is a big issue about abuse of the issue of terrorism in the Arab-Israeli context. I think the Palestinians are entitled to their own state. I don't think they're entitled to go up blowing up people in supermarkets. So a line will have to be drawn. But this is not just a judgment matter. In this sense, Ronald Reagan was wrong when he said one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. There are international conventions, there are Geneva protocols, there are moral principles about where terrorism ends and legitimate use of violence begins. And I think that the U.S. will have to take note of that. But chasing over everybody with a Kalashnikov or a homemade pipe bomb in the world is a very foolish thing. And in that sense, I fear they've put the goal much too high, as well as, of course, not making clear where they think terrorism ends and other forms of violence begin.
On that note, Fred Halliday of the London School of Economics, thank you so much for talking with us. Relita.
John, we have this new development in the investigation into the attacks. The FBI in New York has confirmed that they're actively searching in the area of the Thunderbird Motel in Seaside Heights, New Jersey. Though authorities would not release any details about the nature of the search other than describe it as, quote, pursuing one of the many leads into the potential hijackers or those who may have assisted them. We'll bring you more details on that as soon as they become available. Not just terrorism, leader after American leader has referred to Tuesday's atrocities as an act of war. And for now, at least, the country seems ready to adopt the saying, "We make war that we may live in peace." Bruce Morton explains.
World War II brought Americans together. Most believed that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were evil and aggressive. Americans demanded victory. The phrase of the day was unconditional surrender. Korea and Vietnam, in contrast, divided the country. Vietnam, in particular, left Americans suspicious, leery of wars, and in the conflict since, the motto seems to have been, bomb all you want, but we can't stand American casualties. That seems different now. No yellow ribbons, bring the hostages home, please. Flags this time, half-staff but proud. People are lining up to give blood. The Red Cross 800 number logged 700,000 calls in the first 6 hours after an appeal went out. Some military recruitment officers see an increased interest, and the country seems prepared to send its young people into harm's way.
I think the United States is in a long twilight struggle against these forces of evil that have chosen to destroy us because we are good. And I believe that it may take a lot of time, a lot of American treasure, and perhaps some American blood.
Make no mistake about it, my resolve is steady and strong about winning this war that has been declared on America.
A goal of victory, not compromise. And later, wars change countries. World War II made the United States a world power committed to an international role. Isolationism left behind. Vietnam left the United States more cynical. Americans had learned their government could lie to them. This time, unity so far, agreement on a goal so far. Will that change if the struggle is long? We can't know. The fight is just beginning. Bruce Morton, CNN, Washington.
Updating the latest developments now, word of a pre-dawn raid extending the investigation into the twin attacks on the World Trade Center. The FBI is said now to be searching an area around the Thunderbird Hotel in Seaside Heights, New Jersey. No word on what they're looking for there. The FBI describes it simply as pursuing one of many leads into the potential hijackers. So once again, a pre-dawn raid on the Thunderbird Hotel, an FBI investigation that is still unexplained. A joint U.S.-Philippines raid on a hotel in Manila has resulted in the arrest of 3 people identified as Omanis. Rescuers in New York City are working through rain and lightning as efforts to find survivors continue. It's been almost 3 days since the attacks now. And around 4,700 people are still believed to be missing from the destruction of the World Trade Center. Another 190 people are unaccounted for from the attack on the Pentagon. Meanwhile, the White House and Congress have agreed on a $40 billion emergency aid package for New York and Virginia. The amount of the recovery package is twice the sum originally requested by the White House. And tensions remain high in New York. Police received more than 90 false bomb threats by noon Thursday. In yet another development, authorities have arrested at least 8 people at the city's 2 major airports, one carrying a fake pilot's license. Authorities say that 4 of those arrested were seen at one of the airports the day of the attacks. Law enforcement sources tell CNN the 4 fled that day as they were challenged at the ticket counter. From the United States to Germany to the Philippines, a manhunt is very clearly underway. In the U.S. alone, more than 4,000 FBI agents are working to track down those responsible for Tuesday's attacks. Mike Betcher has more now on the ongoing investigation.
As airports opened across the country, police were watching closely. A total of 8 people were arrested at 2 of New York's airports. At New York's Kennedy Airport, one man who was carrying a fake pilot ID was arrested. 4 or 5 other people trying to check in for flights at Kennedy were detained for questioning, either because they were carrying false documents or were in the country illegally. At New York's LaGuardia Airport, police detained at least 2 other men for questioning. After the spate of arrests and detentions, all New York area airports were closed again. A few other airports in the U.S. have also shut down once more because of security concerns. Attorney General John Ashcroft said FBI agents are making progress in their investigation, adding that they have identified the hijackers aboard all 4 ill-fated jets.
The total number of hijackers, to our best estimate and our best knowledge, given the information at this time, on the 4 planes that crashed was at least 18. Unless contradicted by evidence which we wouldn't anticipate, 2 planes had 5 hijackers and 2 other planes had 4 hijackers each.
Mohammed Atta, shown in this photograph, and Marwan al-Shari are 2 of the men on that list of 18, according to federal investigative sources. Both held United Arab Emirate passports, but it's not clear if they are actually citizens of that country. The lives the 2 men led are the objects of an intensive international investigation, stretching from Florida to Germany. In Hamburg, Germany, federal police launched an extensive search of an apartment shared by Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Shari last February. During an additional search of another Hamburg apartment, a woman was taken away for questioning. She clutched a baby in her arms as German police tried to hide her with a sheet. During the night, a total of 8 apartments were searched in the Hamburg area. Back in the U.S. in Pompano Beach, Florida, FBI agents converged on a small rental car company called Warwick's. Records show that Atta rented 2 automobiles at that location.
Well, the first contract, he only put on 200 miles, 254 miles or something like that. That was very small. That's exceptionally small. The next contract was the 2-week rental, and he drove 1,915 miles, which he had told me he'd been over on the West Coast. He called me from over on the West Coast.
4,000 FBI agents spread across the country knocked on hundreds of doors trying to track down others who were involved in the conspiracy. Before the job is finished, they will have knocked on tens of thousands more. Mike Betcher, CNN, Atlanta.
Sharing the nation's grief, the organizers of most major sporting events have postponed or canceled games and competitions. The National Football League said games set for Sunday will not be played. Major League Baseball put off the resumption of its season until Monday. Most college football games scheduled for the weekend have also been canceled. The Ladies Pro Golf Association also canceled its weekend tournament. NASCAR postponed Sunday's race in New Hampshire until November, and the National Hockey League canceled its preseason games.
U.S. financial markets are closed on this day, but Europe is trading. And for an update now on world markets, we join Richard Quest in London. Richard?
Jonathan, many thanks indeed. Yes, both Asia and European investors continue to hold their nerve this Friday, despite the uncertainty over how Wall Street will react. That happens on Monday at 9:30 Eastern. Let's get an update on what's happening in European markets. Liz George is at the London Stock Exchange. Liz.
Richard, thanks. We are holding our nerve down here on the European markets in London, in the City of London as well. We've seen a little bit of wavering around going on in and out of negative territory, and it's extremely light trade. So really people are saying that there's prices all over the place. People don't really know where to set these prices. They're very, very uncertain. But however, they're trying their best really to retain calm within the markets. I will show you the figures at the moment. We're essentially flat on London's FTSE. Germany's DAX is up around 0.2% at the moment, and in Paris the CAC 40 is up 0.47. It's the technology stocks in Paris which are helping a little bit there, and in Germany it's the large insurance companies and the reinsurers which are actually helping to support that market a little bit there. But the note of caution really is that it's very, very light trade. These figures don't really mean anything at the moment. Everybody's waiting to find out what's going to happen when the US markets reopen. However, there is a feeling that the fighting spirit really will return when those US markets do open, and that the effort will be to keep calm in the market, to do everything that's possible to prevent things like shorting the market and driving it down, and really to keep calm across all of these European bourses and help the US markets to retain calm as well. Richard.
Yes, George, many thanks indeed. Meanwhile, Asian investors are reacting differently to events. Tokyo Nikkei jumped 4%, taking comfort from stability. We're now going to join the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, in Parliament.
Some sectors, like the airlines and insurance industry, will be badly affected. But financial markets have quickly stabilised. The oil producers have helped keep the oil price steady. And businesses proceed as far as possible as normal. So there are three things which we must now take forward urgently. First, we must bring to justice those responsible. Rightly, President Bush and the United States government have proceeded with care. They did not lash out. They did not strike first and think afterwards. Their very deliberation is a measure of the seriousness of their intent. They, together with allies, will want to identify with care those responsible. This is a judgment that must and will be based on hard evidence. Once that judgment is made, the appropriate action can be taken. It will be determined, it will take time, it will continue over time, until this menace is properly dealt with and its machinery of terror destroyed. But one thing should be very clear. By their acts, these terrorists and those behind them have made themselves the enemies of the entire civilized world. Their objective, we know. Our objective will be to bring to account those who have organized, aided, abetted, and incited this act of infamy. And those that harbor or help them have a choice, either to cease their protection of our enemies or be treated as an enemy themselves. Secondly, this is a moment when every difference between nations, every divergence of interest, every irritant in our relations should be put to one side in one common endeavour. The world should stand together against this outrage. NATO has already, for the first time since it was founded in 1949, invoked Article 5 and determined that this attack in America will be considered as an attack against the alliance as a whole. The UN Security Council on Wednesday passed a resolution which set out its readiness to take all necessary steps to combat terrorism. From Russia, China, the European Union, from Arab states, from Asia and the Americas, from every continent of the world has come united condemnation. This solidarity must be maintained and then translated into support for action. Mr. Speaker, we do not yet know the exact origin of this evil. But if, as appears likely, it is so-called Islamic fundamentalists, we know that they do not speak or act for the vast majority of decent, law-abiding Muslims throughout this world. I say to our Arab and Muslim friends, neither you nor Islam is responsible for this. On the contrary, we know you share our shock at this terrorism, and we ask you as friends to make common cause with us in defeating this barbarism that is totally foreign to the true spirit and teachings of Islam. And I would add that now more than ever, we have reason not to let the Middle East peace process slip still further, but if at all possible, to reinvigorate it and move it forward. Thirdly, whatever the nature of the immediate response to these terrible events in America, we need to rethink dramatically the scale and nature of the action the world takes to combat terrorism. We know a good deal about many of these terror groups, but as a world we have not been effective at dealing with them. And of course it is difficult. We are democratic, they are not. We have respect for human life, they do not. We hold essentially liberal values, they do not. As we look into these issues, it is important that we never lose sight of our basic values. But we have to understand the nature of this enemy and act accordingly. Civil liberties are a vital part of our country and of our democratic world. But the most basic liberty of all is the right of the ordinary citizen to go about their business free from fear or terror. That liberty has been denied in the cruelest way imaginable to the passengers aboard the hijacked planes, to those who perished in the trade towers and the Pentagon, to the hundreds of rescue workers killed as they tried to help. So we need to look once more, nationally and internationally, at extradition laws and the mechanisms for international justice, at how these terrorist groups are financed and their money laundered, and the links between terror and crime, and we need to frame a response that will work and will hold internationally. For this form of terror knows no mercy, no pity, and it knows no boundaries. And let us make this reflection too. A week ago, anyone suggesting that terrorists would kill thousands of innocent people in downtown New York would have been dismissed as alarmist. Yet it happened. We know that these groups are fanatics capable of killing without discrimination. The limits on the numbers that they kill and their methods of killing are not governed by any sense of morality. The limits are only practical and technical. We know that they would, if they could, go further and use chemical, biological, or even nuclear weapons of mass destruction. We know also that there are groups or people, occasionally states, who will trade the technology and capability of such weapons. It is time this trade was exposed, disrupted, and stamped out. We have been warned by the events of the 11th of September, and we should act on this warning. So there is a great deal to do, many details to be filled in, much careful work to be undertaken over the coming days and weeks and months. We need to mourn the dead and then act to protect the living. Terrorism has taken on a new and frightening aspect. The people perpetrating it wear the ultimate badge of the fanatic. They are prepared to commit suicide, to die in pursuit of their beliefs. Our beliefs are the very opposite of those of the fanatics. We believe in reason, democracy, and tolerance. And these beliefs are the foundation of our civilized world. They are enduring, they have served us well, and as history has shown, we have been prepared to fight when necessary to defend them. The fanatics should know that we hold our beliefs every bit as strongly as they hold theirs. And now is the time to show it.
Ian Duncan Smith. Mr. Speaker, may I start by thanking you for the opportunity to...
The British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, addressing a recall of Parliament, an indication of the seriousness of the event. It's only the 18th time that Parliament has been recalled since 1948. To assess what Mr. Blair said, I'm joined by CNN's European political editor. He's Robin Oakley. Robin, terrorists have made themselves the enemies of the civilised world.
Yes, we've had the theme already from Mr. Blair. This is an attack not just on the United States, but on democratic values worldwide. Key phrase, I think, when he said, "We stand by our friends." And quite clearly, whatever reservations there may be in any other quarters, in NATO or elsewhere, there will be full military support from Britain for United States action. Interesting that Mr. Blair commended the United States for not striking back immediately without thinking, and he talked about a long slog ahead, a period of care, finding out exactly who was responsible and exactly the right way of hitting back at them.
But hitting back at them, clearly the Prime Minister standing full square with the US President. Mr. Blair saying we must expose, disrupt and stamp out the terrorism. That's military action.
Indeed, it is military action, and I think, again, an important part of what Mr. Blair had to say was that the countries who harbour the terrorists now have a choice. They can either be treated as the enemies of the civilised world and continue to harbour, or they can come aboard. But clearly there is an intention on behalf of the United States and of Britain to hit back at countries who harbour terrorists as well as the terrorists themselves.
The British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw said yesterday that we know up to 100 British citizens have lost their lives, along with those of other nations, and it could be in the middle hundreds. This is clearly more than just a US incident in that sense.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are countries all over the world now counting their dead in the Twin Towers in the United States. And across Europe, we're hearing more and more noise of casualties. In Britain, ministers are saying privately it could be a total of up to 500. But just one other note I think we need to introduce here. Mr. Blair was very careful to say, although he pointed the finger at Islamic fundamentalists, the Muslim community as a whole, he said, must not be blamed. I think there are strong worries among the politicians of a backlash against Muslim communities everywhere.
Robin Oakley, many thanks indeed. The British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, you see there with Ian Duncan Smith, the new leader of the opposition, talking to the British Parliament, and a recall, the first time it's been recalled back in the summer recess. It's the only 18th time it's happened since 1948. Now back to CNN Center in Atlanta.
Richard, thank you. Former U.S. President Bill Clinton, along with his daughter Chelsea, toured the wreckage of the World Trade Center on Thursday. Chelsea Clinton was only 12 blocks away when the towers collapsed Tuesday. Clinton says President Bush should receive the full support of the American people.
I have two children in the military. He's their dad. He was in on the first and 12th floor, first thing the other morning. It's boys down in California, and we need to know where he is.
Thank you for your service.
This touches so much.
They're still fighting people. Don't lose hope.
Thank you very much.
We need to support the president and the national government without regard to party, without regard to anything. What we need to do is just they'll do the right thing.
A hard rain has been beating down on the twisted wreckage of Lower Manhattan. The poor weather is slowing the work of rescue workers who have been toiling into the early morning hours. Garrick Utley joins us once again from New York City with more. Garrick.
Yes, Relitza, and we're going to talk not so much about that rescue work. The workers are still there at the scene. But another example, another test of how difficult it is for people in New York to adjust as life begins to return to normal. Case in point, Broadway. The theaters went dark. They were closed for 2 nights because of the tragedy. On Thursday night, they reopened. The lights were there. The bands were playing. The curtain went up. And the big hit on Broadway is The Producers. A big hit. Each seat ticket costs about $100. You can't get a ticket until the end of 2002. People would sell their soul, perhaps sacrifice their firstborn to get in. You just can't do it. Forget it. If you're not familiar with The Producers, suffice it to say it's Mel Brooks' musical comedy with the emphasis on comedy, which involves Adolf Hitler. I'll not go into any details, but it does work as a hit. Anyway, tonight the curtain went up, the first time after the tragedy. There were 100 cancellations. 100 people felt, for as long as I've waited for this great opportunity this night in the theater, I couldn't really bring myself to face it. The sign of our times these days in New York City. And Lauren Sidney reports on the theater today.
For the first time in Broadway history, other than during labor disputes, the show people were silenced for 3 performances in a row. But on Thursday, when regular performances resumed, the old adage, the show must go on, rang true.
It's going to be a little weird. I don't know what to expect, and I don't know whether anybody will come.
But they did come, with mixed emotions.
I feel bad. I just feel that there's 8,000 people buried 2 miles away, and I'm here at a show that's going to be laughing. I'm sorry.
I can't sit and watch it anymore. I can't listen to the names being called out, and it breaks my heart, and I know it breaks everybody's heart.
I waited a long time, you know. I got the tickets a long time ago, and I don't think it does anybody any good if I don't go.
Before the curtain went up, all 23 Broadway houses respectfully dimmed their lights. When the lights went back on at the hit show The Producers, the audience was met by the show's producer.
Each and every one of you has said tonight by coming here, I'm not afraid. Right.
Nor were the show's stars, Nathan Lane and Matthew Broderick.
We all have to try, because otherwise, in a sense, they win, and they are robbing us of our lives, and they've already taken too much.
No, I love it here. You know, I love this city, and it's part of what makes me sad is that those bastards attacked this city.
Broadway, like the rest of the nation, is beginning its healing process.
That great song by New York's Irving Berlin, well, it says it all, doesn't it? Jonathan and Relitza.
Garrick, thank you. I'm Relitza Vasilova. Coming up, more of our coverage of America Under Attack, the search for answers.
And on this National Day of Remembrance in the United States, we leave you with some images of the disaster and its aftermath. I'm Jonathan Mann.
Rain in New York. Our 24-hour coverage of this attack on America is going full steam right now. And as you can see, this sudden storm has forced rescuers to stop working. And right now, these are exclusive pictures of damage beyond comprehension. Yet some 1,000 firefighters, paramedics, and volunteers are determined to push on.
And in Washington, another site of the attack on America. This is the Pentagon this hour. Again, this morning, we're live in New York and Washington.
Good morning. I'm Carol Lynn.
And I'm Jonathan Mann. Thanks for joining us.
It is a busy hour. We have an enormous amount of information to share with you, from the latest on the investigation to the heartbreaking search for the missing. Also, a unique look inside a fire station, a firehouse that has lost as many as 30 people.
And a trip to Berryville, Virginia, a town like fictional Mayberry, to see how small town America is holding up.
But first, let's take a look at the latest developments. President Bush has declared this a national day of prayer and remembrance for many of the victims.
And in the Philippine capital, Manila, police working with U.S. agents raided a hotel room. Residue of bomb-making material has been found. Also on the investigative front, several arrests in New York and suspicions of another attempted hijacking.
That's right, Jonathan. But first, let's also remind you that in Kabul, Afghanistan, fears of an attack from the United States, which has said leaders are believed to be harboring suspected terrorist Osama bin Laden. Much more on that in just a moment, but first we are going to go to New York City. It is a city so different than just a few days ago. Our Garrick Utley has been there much of the night. Morning, Garrick.
Thank you. Morning. Thank you, Carol. Different in many ways. Of course, there's the destruction since Tuesday, but those people who've been here in New York have also noticed that this week has been glorious in terms of weather. Warm, upper 70s, blue sky, no clouds in the sky. And yet this evening, or last night, Thursday night, into the morning hours of Friday morning, that changed. A big thunderstorm moved through. A lightning storm has interrupted the rescue work effort down there, which you see, the cloud of smoke and dust, which still rises. 3 days after the incidents, the tragedy there. But the rescue workers are still prepared to continue their searches. Unfortunately, on Thursday, they did not recover any survivors from the disaster. The city officials here in New York have estimated that more than 4,760 is the number they've offered, are missing there. And you look at those pictures, and once again, we've seen them before, you understand why. And those are some of the rescue workers who have been crawling through the debris today, working very carefully because there's great risk to them of falling debris, falling walls, of falling into holes that they can't see. In fact, that's happened several times. There have been some serious injuries to rescue workers who had to be hospitalized with back injuries and other abrasions. Nevertheless, it continues. But along with the rescue efforts, New Yorkers have been doing other things to observe the tragedy. There have been a number of vigils, services, informal, spontaneous ones. Last night it was in Washington Square. That is Wednesday night. On Thursday night it was in Union Square nearby. The scene is always the same. It is people gathering in community. There are candles, there are American flags, there are some prayers, there's some music. Most of all, there's just getting together and communing and being close. And what's happening there, or what happened there in this small gathering, or relatively small gathering, will be seen on Friday in churches across the nation, because as you've reported, Carol, this is going to be the National Day of Prayer and Remembrance. And in Washington, D.C., at the National Cathedral, the President will be participating with other dignitaries and officials and people from the Washington community to lead a service of prayer and remembrance, and this will reverberate and be echoed across the nation. Indeed, almost every day of this week since the tragedy on Tuesday, there have been nonstop prayers and certainly a lot of remembering. And as far as New Yorkers are concerned and their daily lives of getting about the big city of New York City, well, there's going to be some improvement. What you're seeing down there where the tragedy occurred is the southern tip of Manhattan called Lower Manhattan. That's been a no-go area. Now, since Tuesday, a large part of southern Manhattan has been cordoned off from 14th Street below. Well, now city officials are saying they're going to ease up, and the boundary for traffic at 14th Street there in the upper part of the map you're seeing on your screen is being extended down to Canal Street, which runs through parts of Chinatown and Little Italy. So another big chunk of lower Manhattan is being given back to the automobile, and no doubt on Friday there will be traffic jams galore once the cars can take to the streets. But you can also see how much of lower Manhattan is still a no-go area as far as general traffic is concerned. So that is really where we are, and an interesting test for New Yorkers and traffic will occur tomorrow. President Bush comes to the city following that service in Washington, D.C. He'll attend a service here. Normally when presidents come, there are traffic jams everywhere. It is a nightmare because the motorcade has to come in under tight security. This time, though, the White House has given no indication as to the precise movements of the president, where he's going to be at what time, obviously for security reasons. It's also going to be interesting to see whether special precautions are taken or measures are taken so that perhaps this time he doesn't tie up traffic the way other presidents have on their visits. Maybe he'll use a helicopter, who knows, to get to the lower tip of Manhattan. New Yorkers can only wish that. Anyway, he's expected to be here only for a short period of time before he goes back to Washington. That's how Friday is shaping up here in New York City. Back to you in Atlanta.
Garrick, I know we had to pull you inside from your perch on the rooftop because of the weather out there. We do certainly hope it clears up for the rescuers who are working down south in lower Manhattan. I'm just wondering, now that things are beginning to slowly get back a little bit more towards normal in New York, is it beginning to sink in? Is it beginning to sink in with New Yorkers how few bodies and how few people alive they are pulling out of the wreckage?
Absolutely. There's a very painful human process at work. We've been reporting, we'll continue to report, how people gather here at various centers to exchange information, ask for information. They come with pictures of their friends and relatives who are lost. They want to make any kind of information. They're always talking in the present tense about their loved ones as if they're still alive. I know he or she is down in the rubble. We want them to come back. And officials really aren't saying that hope should be abandoned. They're letting people go through the natural process. And at what time, at what day, and how many days after Tuesday will these New Yorkers have to accept, or will they accept, or want to accept, that perhaps their loved ones have been lost? Nobody can put a time on this. This is a decision, the most painful human decision each human being has to make. But I suspect over these coming days, it's a decision that many will have to make. Many of the friends and relatives of those 4,760 people, at least that number, according to city officials, who are missing.
Yeah, Garrick, it certainly made all the more painful for so many people who actually heard from their loved ones after the first plane went into the first tower. People confirming with them over the cell phone, I'm okay, I'm getting out of the building, and they haven't been heard from since. So certainly the mayor of New York trying to prepare people for the worst.
I think they are prepared for it, but it's going to take, I suspect, several more days, probably the first part of next week, and then the evidence will speak for itself. Right. Once again, no survivors were pulled from the disaster area there yesterday on Thursday.
All right. Thank you very much, Garrick Utley. We're going to go to Ground Zero in just a few minutes. Alessio Vinci is covering the rescuers there, but first, right now, to Jonathan.
New York officials are expected to announce shortly when they'll reopen area airports after suspicions about another hijacking attempt shut them down yesterday. Authorities say they've arrested 8 suspects, some with fake IDs and one with a phony pilot's license. CNN's national correspondent Mike Betcher wraps up the latest in the global manhunt for terrorists.
As airports opened across the country, police were watching closely. A total of 8 people were arrested at 2 of New York's airports. At New York's Kennedy Airport, one man who was carrying a fake pilot ID was arrested. 4 or 5 other people trying to check in for flights at Kennedy were detained for questioning, either because they were carrying false documents or were in the country illegally. At New York's LaGuardia Airport, police detained at least 2 other men for questioning. After the spate of arrests and detentions, all New York area airports were closed again. A few other airports in the U.S. have also shut down once more because of security concerns. Attorney General John Ashcroft said FBI agents are making progress in their investigation, adding that they have identified the hijackers aboard all 4 ill-fated jets.
The total number of hijackers, to our best estimate and our best knowledge, given the information at this time, on the 4 planes that crashed was at least 18. Unless contradicted by evidence which we wouldn't anticipate, 2 planes had 5 hijackers and 2 other planes had 4 hijackers each.
Mohammed Atta, shown in this photograph, and Marwan al-Shari are 2 of the men on that list of 18, according to federal investigative sources. Both held United Arab Emirate passports, but it's not clear if they are actually citizens of that country. The lives the two men led are the objects of an intensive international investigation, stretching from Florida to Germany. In Hamburg, Germany, federal police launched an extensive search of an apartment shared by Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Shari last February. During an additional search of another Hamburg apartment, a woman was taken away for questioning. She clutched a baby in her arms as German police tried to hide her with a sheet. During the night, a total of 8 apartments were searched in the Hamburg area. Back in the U.S. in Pompano Beach, Florida, FBI agents converged on a small rental car company called Warwick's. Records show that Atta rented 2 automobiles at that location.
Well, the first contract, he only put on 200 miles, 254 miles or something like that. That was very small. That's exceptionally small. The next contract was the 2-week rental, and he drove 1,915 miles, which he had told me he'd been over on the West Coast. He called me from over on the West Coast.
4,000 FBI agents spread across the country knocked on hundreds of doors trying to track down others who were involved in the conspiracy. Before the job is finished, they will have knocked on tens of thousands more. Mike Betcher, CNN, Atlanta.
Authorities say one of the biggest leads in the investigation is coming from a strip club in Daytona Beach, Florida. The manager told FBI agents 3 men were in the club Monday night making threatening comments.
America's going to see bloodshed tomorrow, and within 10 hours, you're seeing planes crashing into the Trade Center, a plane crashing into the Pentagon. We didn't think anything of it until the next day, but then the next day it came down on us like a ton of bricks. We told them that we had 3 gentlemen of Middle Eastern descent had made these comments. We have their driver's licenses, we have their credit cards, and then also a Quran was left here.
Cap promised authorities not to reveal the men's names, but he says they lived in Central Florida in communities between Daytona Beach and Orlando. Another key piece of evidence in the investigation will soon be in the hands of experts. Searchers say they have found the black box from the airliner that crashed in Pennsylvania. Investigators have said they also received signals from the flight recorder at the Pentagon crash site. National transportation safety experts have been sent to New York, Pennsylvania, and the Pentagon to assist in locating and analyzing the cockpit voice recorders and flight data recorders.
Jonathan, now that we've had a chance to take a look at the latest in the investigation, let's go to what's happening in terms of rescues down in Lower Manhattan. Alessio Vinci standing by there. Alessio, we've got you on the phone right now because our signal is being disrupted by the weather also disrupting those rescue efforts. Are workers back to work?
Yes, they are. The Port Authority officials are telling us now that the rescue operation has resumed. Rain, thunder, and lightning overnight forced more than 1,000 rescue workers to temporarily suspend their operation. But as I said, we can confirm now that the rescue operation is back on. However, chances to find anybody alive are growing dim at this point. Rescue workers, however, they say they continue to hope that perhaps underneath that pile of rubble, somebody, perhaps in an air pocket or underneath a large piece of concrete, may still be alive and that they have to continue their work. There is still, of course, also concern for the safety of the rescue workers themselves. Some of the buildings nearby, what was the World Trade Center, may have suffered some structural damage, and there is, of course, concern about their stability. One of those buildings is the tall American Express building. Rescue workers used it as a morgue and triage center. It was evacuated on Wednesday, and on Thursday, workers were pulled back from the area nearby. More than 6,000 tons of debris has been removed from by exhausted and determined rescue workers. The debris has been taken by dumpster trucks to Staten Island, where the FBI is examining it, perhaps in search of clues which could reveal the identity of the hijackers. Perhaps the most frustrating part of this rescue operation, Carol, is the fact that mostly what is being recovered from the rubble are body parts, and the latest figures released last night speak for themselves. 184 sets of human remains have been found, and 47 whole bodies, of which only 35 have so far been identified. These numbers will change at some point. We know that the authorities here have requested more than 5,000 body bags, and certainly it is going to be in the thousands, the number of people that in the end will have perished in this tragedy. Finally, to give you just a better sense about the magnitude of the disaster, one engineer on site were telling us that the area looked like a living hell, and and another explained to us that the impact of the two falling towers created a seismic force not very different from an earthquake. Carol?
Yeah, and just taking a look at these exclusive video pictures that we're showing the audience right now, Alessio, it certainly just shows the force of impact, how marble and stone and glass disintegrated into dust. It's a very grim picture. Obviously, the predictions for a lot of deaths still stand, but at the same time, give us an idea of the ups and downs of this rescue operation, because while we look at this grim picture, yesterday we saw a firefighter get pulled out of the wreckage and he walked away.
Well, yes, Carol, you have to imagine that there was a lot of falling debris. I mean, two 110 stories towers falling, collapsing, pancaking into each other. It was really, you have to imagine there was a lot of large piece of concrete that perhaps may have shielded some of the people who were perhaps on the lower floors of those two buildings. And we have seen throughout this day how the rescue workers, despite the fact that the chances of finding anybody alive are dim, really being extremely determined, extremely focused in trying to find and trying to hear if there's any signal of life or anything that would be able to help them to point where some of the people may be alive. And we have seen earlier today, for example, some reports, some of the firefighters may have to be found alive, and we heard a lot of the people there cheering for a moment. That report, unfortunately, ended up not being true, but it can give you a better sense about how here what everybody's focused on is to try to find somebody alive.
Right, absolute hope. Thank you very much. Alessio Vinci reporting from Lower Manhattan. Well, as you just saw and you just heard from Alessio, all the rescue work has to be done very carefully by hand. Workers picking up shards of glass and metal and stone, lifting carefully to ensure the rubble doesn't collapse on anybody who is still alive. It is such a painstaking process. Just listen to volunteer Steve Simmons.
I mean, it's really unbelievable. I rode down, late yesterday afternoon, and you knew what to expect. You had an idea what to expect when you got down there, but it was like nothing you could imagine. I mean, everything around the area was just completely, just destroyed. Just basically you're shoulder to shoulder with guys, passing buckets of debris, carrying stuff, lifting, intermittently you have a part of a plane, you've got a part of a building, and just handing it back and forth, just long lines, and it's just amazing people in the line. The general mood there was somewhat levity. Guys are trying to, the false bravado, trying to be really, hey, we're just at work, we're doing this. And then somebody would, they'd find a shoe, or they, maybe they thought they heard something, maybe a radio from somebody. And, just everyone just yelled for quiet. You have this whole hush come down, all the machinery would stop. And, if there was anything, you just see people just digging, just on their hands and knees, just digging away, trying to find anything. And, and then it's a few minutes later, it's back to the same, just passing stuff along. I'm just a local guy. I rode down, I'm an equity trader. And I got on the bus with a bunch of iron workers and construction workers, and I rode in with those guys, and they let me in. And, these guys doing this on any given day, you pass on the street, I'm in a suit, they're in a tank top. There's no contact. On the bus, it's like, hey, brother, let's go, let's dig in. And it's just this amazing resolve.
Amazing resolve indeed, the human spirit there. Well, right before the Twin Towers collapsed, hundreds of police and firefighters were on the scene trying to help people escape. And the loss, it appears to be enormous. Many of them are now missing. CNN's Richard Blystone has been to one Manhattan fire station where many are still unaccounted for.
These are the guys who run up the fire escape when everybody else is running down. The men who will get you out of an inferno 50 stories in the air or die trying. 30 men from this Midtown Manhattan firehouse may have died trying. They were among the first to reach the trade towers Tuesday, and they haven't come back.
So as you can see, the neighborhoods had an outpouring of love for us.
Night and day they come to leave a flower, light a candle.
I felt I did something. Yes, I felt like I did something.
Hard-boiled New Yorkers.
When I was sitting out on somebody's car over there in disbelief, I had my head in my hands, and I felt somebody just kind of give a little squeeze on my arm. I look up, and it was just somebody walking past.
Total strangers, like this woman from Argentina, who says she had to come and touch the firemen. They're heroes, she says. They gave their lives, poor things, to save other people. These students from Montreal were here on a night on the town early Tuesday.
We happened to walk by, they're smiling. We said, hey, how's it going? Nice to meet you.
got on the truck, we took pictures, everybody was happy, and now we hear that some of the people who we met might be missing.
They were the first ones to go. It's just devastating. It's like, I can't believe we were here like 6 hours before this with those people.
You don't think much about firemen until you need them. But people are making up for that today, not waiting for a memorial to be built. They've created one outside the firehouse, more vibrant and more moving than anything a sculptor could carve out of stone.
Their courage and fearlessness just sets an example for the world. It's very, very powerful. And I'm honored. I'm honored to know they're just down the street from me.
If your friends are missing, it's a hard wait. A small distraction, in the words of support, the presence of food and flowers, and this present from Parsippany, New Jersey, to replace one of the station's 5 lost trucks.
Whatever you need it for, you got it. We just bought a new one. This is up for sale. You guys want it, you're more than welcome to it. We're still in business. Guys going out, what we have to do, protect the people, the city.
And so, those lucky enough to have done more than wait go home for a rest. Because it's not over. And it would be nice to think that in times to come, when the memories come flooding back, they will remember these as well. Richard Blystone, CNN, New York.
It is not over yet for that family of firefighters, nor is it over for hundreds of families still searching for their loved ones. But the grim reality is beginning to take hold for many of these families who are gathering near the disaster scene at a national armory. They are filling out questionnaires, holding up photos, passing out homemade flyers with their missing relatives' pictures on them. It is a desperate search and a desperate wait. Elizabeth Cohen spoke with some of them.
Last we heard, it was my sister. She spoke to him on Monday, and he was so happy that he was just purchased his new house, and he was just really glad. And then he went into work on Tuesday, and we haven't heard since. I mean, it's such a tragedy. You know, we've been looking for him for 3 days already, and we haven't found anything. We stand online, swapping information so we can swap information with, other people that are missing their loved ones.
And many people from his company are missing, is that right?
Yes. Conta Fitzgerald it was located between 101 and 104th, and that's where the impact hit the most. And it's just, we're waiting. I mean, we're waiting for some results, or for the company even to come up and step up and look for us and say, give us some little comfort, because we need their support as well. And we haven't seen them yet. Please, if anybody has seen my brother, please give us a call. You can reach us at 201-346-9018, or you can reach his wife at 1718-698-6982. She's desperately is looking for him, or to hear about him. He has a daughter, 7-month-old, and he's really.
Please, I'm the wife of Peter Mutos, and we just want to let all his relatives know, and Peter as well, that we're not going to give up until we find you. We love you.
Where was he in the World Trade Center?
He was on the 100th floor in building number 1.
I'm hoping that this is a way for the media, who has more access than we do, to be able to go around and identify him or try to find him for me. This is the second time we're going through this nightmare again. He was also involved in the 93 World Trade bombing. And I feel that this time the media can help me, or, to find him, or get, if not a glimpse of hope, some answers as to his, whereabouts. I'm trying to keep the faith, and I'm trying just to search for him. I want him to come home.
I'm looking for Salvatore Ziza, my brother-in-law, who has 2 young children at home and a very large family. And the pain that we feel, we express the same sentimentality to the thousands of people that are out on this street. As much pain as we feel, we wish everyone else here our best. The experience that we've had from all the authorities that we've dealt with including everything the girl before me mentioned, the same process, the same sources. Everybody is doing their best to help. There are thousands of people on the street from every organization and then some trying to help us all.
Tell me, there seems to be sort of a brotherhood, a sisterhood that's grown up on this street corner.
I haven't seen the American karma come together like this since the Vietnam War. Everybody feels the same way. Everybody has anger, but everybody has compassion. There is no script for what to say, and there's no script for how to feel. I've run into probably 10 people that have Marsh McLennan signs on their pictures, and I don't know their names and I don't know where they're from, but they've hugged me and they've cried with me together. Everybody is feeling the same thing. There is no script. However, we're reading off of the same lines.
There is no script because the pictures just say so much. And we here at CNN, we're trying to help as well with the families. We're posting pictures of people missing in this tragedy on CNN.com, and you can email photos of missing friends or relatives to missing@cnn.com, or you can go to cnn.com and click on the link. We'll also post emergency contact telephone numbers for you there as well.
For all of the devastation, for all of the smoke and dust that still hang in the rainy sky over lower Manhattan, for all of the lives lost or in limbo now, much credit is going to the architects of the World Trade Center, because it could have been very much worse. Their building design prevented what could have been a much larger disaster. CNN's David George explains.
It was the attack that was never supposed to happen. And when it did, what happened next happened just like it was supposed to.
The building rocked like you were on a ship, and it swayed back and forth a couple of times.
The World Trade Center's North Tower shook and swayed, but thanks to a design concept engineers call redundancy, did not fall, not right away.
If the load carrying capability is disturbed or destroyed in one area, within reason, it should be able to, the structure should be able to transfer the load from that point and carry it down to the foundation using a different path.
That's what happened at the World Trade Center. After the impact, the North Tower stood for more than an hour, long enough for hundreds, perhaps thousands, to escape. The collapse, when it came, was caused by fire.
The fire was very, very intense and burned for a long time. The fire weakened that portion of the structure which remained after the impact. It was weakened by the fire to the point where it could no longer sustain the load.
When the World Trade Center towers did fall, they pancaked onto themselves, minimizing damage to adjacent structures, just like the center's designers had intended should disaster ever strike. In the 90s, after Oklahoma City, many government buildings were retrofitted to better withstand bomb blasts. But when an airliner hit the heavily reinforced Pentagon, the seat of the nation's military leadership didn't stand a chance.
A large jet full of fuel hitting a structure is about as severe as it gets.
In the days after the World Trade Center tragedy, Georgia Tech's Barry Goodnow suggested it would be technically possible, but too expensive, to design a totally disaster-proof building, unless, he said, the building were built underground. David George, CNN.
Let's check our latest developments now. This is a day for Americans to take time to remember the many victims of these attacks.
Also, on the investigation, Jonathan, we've just learned that a hotel room in Manila has been raided by Philippine and U.S. agents. No one has been arrested, but they did find some bomb-making residue. And also here in the United States, off the coast of Florida, the Coast Guard has detained 2 people taken off a Carnival cruise ship. They want to ask some questions. We are looking into whether this has any direct link to Tuesday's terrorist attack.
Overseas, Afghanistan's ruling Taliban say suspected terrorist Osama bin Laden was not involved in the attacks. Taliban leaders say, though, they fear American retaliatory strikes. We'll turn our attention now to the Pentagon, where a fire flared up again briefly overnight, stopping rescue work. Apparently they're back at it now. We'll get more from CNN's Mark Potter, who was at the Pentagon. Mark?
Well, Jonathan, that fire halted recovery operations for a while until firefighters could get in there and put the fire out. It took them about 25 minutes to do that. and no one was hurt, fortunately. As we can see from this live picture now, that fire is out. Recovery operations continue. However, there was a new concern being reported this morning. Officials are worried about weather reports suggesting that bad weather may come rolling in here, as it has already done in New York. And with the fragile structure there that we're looking at, there are concerns about whether the operation here would be allowed to continue. And they may have to halt it again. They'll just have to see. Right now, though, even at this early hour in the morning, those operations continue. The workers continue to dig through the rubble and to shore up the building. They're still trying to find bodies, and they're searching for the cockpit voice and data recorders, the so-called black boxes from the American Airlines 757, which crashed into the building Tuesday morning. The Pentagon says its best estimate now is that around 190 people died here Tuesday morning, including the passengers on that plane. The bodies are being taken for identification and preparation to the mortuary at the Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. Now, survivors of the attack are talking now about their experiences. Many of them have extremely dramatic stories about what happened to them when the plane hit and how they were able to escape alive.
Indeed, we were indeed working about 100 feet from what I call ground zero. I was talking to a friend, a major friend of mine in the Army, who was calling up to ask if I had heard about the World Trade Center, and of course I did. Everybody in the Pentagon did. The whole Pentagon was abuzz that morning with the video footage of that. And she jokingly told me, you know, the Pentagon is probably next. You ought to get out of there. And we sort of chuckled about that. And she said again, I'm serious, David. You really ought to get out of there. And it was at that moment that I've described it as the gates of hell opening up. The wall that was beside me just simply crumpled, much the way that you would crumple a piece of loose leaf paper. And you have a moment there to realize what is happening. And probably because she had planted the seed in my mind, I knew instantaneously what was happening. And I thought, we're under attack. And there was a brilliant flash of light which came from the corners of the wall which had given away. And immediately I was thrown about 25 feet back into the office next door. Still had the phone in my hand.
Now, later this morning, there will be prayer services here at the Pentagon in conjunction with the National Day of Prayer and Remembrance called by President Bush. In the meantime, the daily operations here at the Pentagon continue in full amid reports from Pentagon officials that President Bush is considering calling up as many as 50,000 military reservists to help, we are told, with disaster relief efforts, and also to assist National Guard pilots who have been flying combat air patrols in the Washington and New York area. They're continuing to do that, we're told. They are also on standby at 26 bases around the country. Back to you.
We've heard a great deal about how treacherous the conditions are at the World Trade Center, how dangerous the recovery work is there. The Pentagon, of course, is a much shorter building, and most of it still stands. Is it a safer environment for those who are working?
No, it's not. There are still hot spots that have to be taken into consideration. As soon as the workers opened up an area, fire officials say the air got in there and triggered a fire from one of those hot spots, and workers had to flee the area right away. Fortunately, as I said earlier, no one was hurt. This is an unstable environment, and that's why they're so concerned now about this weather coming in. We don't know yet if it'll happen, but they are worried that they might have to halt recovery operations again. We'll just have to see.
Mark Potter at the Pentagon. Thanks. Carol.
John, this is, of course, the scene from the nation's capital, and we've been to New York City, but this terrorist attack stretches from these cities all the way to rural America. It is a tragedy uniting towns big and small. As CNN senior political correspondent Candy Crowley found in Berryville, Virginia.
Berryville, Virginia is an hour's drive from the Pentagon, far enough away not to have heard terrorism's roar, close enough to feel its pain.
I spent all day yesterday at the Pentagon working the fire.
A pretty terrible scene.
Yeah, it's about as unbelievable as TV doesn't do it any justice. It's horrible.
After 48 hours on call, D.C. firefighter Craig Hageman came home to Berryville and bought a couple of flags.
I believe in my country. I believe in everything we're about. And the more I support it, and the more everybody else will support it, and it's just keeping the faith.
Berryville's the kind of place where the barber is a minister and the mayor and his mother run the flower shop. the kind of place where putting up flags was second nature. No meetings, no proposals. It just kind of happened.
They came out late on Tuesday, and just sort of a spontaneous thing from the town office. So we decided that we have these flags that we obviously put up for Memorial Day and Labor Day and 4th of July and special occasions like that, and just thought this was a good time to put them out, just to show some support.
They are everywhere now. They hang from the mirrors of Potter's Barbershop.
Well, we all love a country. And we have big pride in the country. And it's hard to tell you what patriotism is. It's got to be inside.
They decorate every table inside Jane's Lunch, a third-generation diner.
I feel helpless here in Berryville. What can I do? I can't go to New York and help those people. I can give blood. But that's the extent of what I can do.
Population 3,000, Berryville is small-town America. Berryville is Mayberry, only instead of Sheriff Andy Taylor, you find Officer Anthony Roper.
It's kind of funny. I've driven around the last couple of days, and an older gentleman, retired military gentleman, been saluting me and really coming up and asking and appreciating us. And I guess this as a whole, seeing how the country's reacted to all of this, the people being very patriotic.
But there is more than patriotism here. There is defiance. Just after Pearl Harbor, a Japanese admiral said, "I fear all we have done is to have awakened a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Listen now to some of the voices of Berryville.
I'm not Bush, but if I was, I'd be relocating the B-52s to Guam. We got to find out who did it.
I'm sure the President Bush is going to take care of business.
You want him to?
Hell yeah. Everybody's pissed, ain't they? Sure.
They usually sell 10 copies of the New York Times at the Berryville newsstand. Wednesday morning, they sold 80, along with every other paper they had. They talk of little else over latte and chocolate chip cookies.
First is, I can't believe it, and now there's such anger, and we better blast the hell out of somebody. Everybody's ready to flatten someone for having done this.
The sleeping giant stirs again now in a small town. Candy Crowley, CNN, Berryville, Virginia.
Regardless of whether it's a small town or a large city, many Americans will join President Bush today in a national day of prayer and remembrance of Tuesday's victims. CNN White House correspondent Major Garrett joins us now with the latest. Major?
Jonathan, indeed, the president has called for today to be a national day of prayer and remembrance, asking Americans across the country at their lunch hour to go to their place of worship and say a prayer not only for those victims in Virginia and New York, but also for the recovery and rescue efforts underway in both locations. And today, early this morning, while most of official Washington slept, the first tangible efforts that those pledges of swift bipartisan support for President Bush are in fact real. The White House and congressional negotiators reaching a deal early this morning on a $40 billion emergency supplemental bill that will provide money for New York and Virginia to clean up and recover as much as they can, and also provide President Bush the financial wherewithal he needs to prosecute a counterterrorism offensive against those found by the U.S. government responsible for the attacks in Virginia and in New York. $10 billion of that can be made immediately available by the stroke of the president's pen. Another $10 billion will be released by Congress upon notification from President Bush. Then $20 billion will be set in a contingency fund that Congress will release after consultations with President Bush. Earlier on Thursday night on Larry King Live, House Speaker Dennis Hastert explained not only the reasons behind that supplemental emergency spending bill, but also a separate piece of legislation the White House and Congress are working on, providing President Bush the legal authority to prosecute a war against terrorism.
We're working with them. We have to have this type of cooperation to make sure that both the ability to give the president the power is something that we can all agree on, and also the amount of money that we need to clean up the problems, to take care of our victims in Virginia and New York, and incidentally families that go through that whole Northeast area. And then go forward and fund the investigation and the ability to bring these terrorists to justice.
Another obligation, of course, for President Bush is to try in some small ways to soothe the grief, to some small way minimize the trauma felt by so many. He's done so here in the Washington area on Thursday, accompanied by the First Lady Laura Bush. The first family went to George Washington Hospital Center to meet some of the victims of the plane crash at the Pentagon, consoling not only victims who were injured in the original crash, but some who were injured trying to rescue those who were injured in the original crash, and also meeting some of the doctors and nurses. The president saying afterwards he was very, very moved, not only by the suffering, but by the help and aid so many had provided those injured. The president will get a much larger dose of that experience later today when he flies to New York City, the epicenter of grief, suffering, and heroism, the center of New York, center of Manhattan, where the Twin Towers have collapsed. So many are buried, and so many others are working tirelessly to try to deal with the wreckage. Mayor Giuliani and New York's Governor George Pataki will be with the president, guiding him along both in an aerial survey and on the ground. Thursday from the Oval Office, the president talked to both Mayor Giuliani of New York and the Governor of New York, George Pataki, a Republican, saluting them on what he described as their heroic efforts to deal with this catastrophe in New York City and pledging all the federal resources available. The president will not only bring his ability to provide emotional and spiritual sustenance to those on the ground in New York City, but also, as I mentioned, the $10 billion of immediate federal assistance and promises of more, courtesy of the action by Congress, which is expected to be approved, by the way, by the House and Senate on Friday, and the president should be able to sign that legislation on Saturday. Those are many of the realities the president is dealing with. There is yet another one here in Washington. An eerie sense of trepidation, a sense of being edgy about the security of the White House and the surrounding area. On Thursday afternoon, the Secret Service extended the security perimeter around the White House, and all this morning in the darkness, helicopter hovers above Washington, above the White House, shining its searchlight down around the compound around the White House and the surrounding areas, a signal, a sign, visible and audible, of the heightened sense of security throughout the nation's capital. You can see it now, the light, the spotlight from the helicopter piercing the early morning darkness, just on watch. It's not a sense of panic in any stretch here in Washington, but very, very much a sense of precaution. Jonathan.
Major, the president will be traveling to mark this day of prayer and remembrance. He was traveling, of course, on Tuesday when he and we learned of this enormous disaster. You were with the president then. Can you tell us about those first stunning moments?
It was amazing. The thing that strikes me most, Jonathan, is that there is always a sense people have about the President of the United States, any President of the United States, and those who work for him, that they're always on top of everything, that they know what's happening in any given situation at any given moment. And I can tell you, never before have I learned that that's not true than that morning. The president went for an early morning jog in Sarasota, Florida, enjoyed it very much, joked with reporters afterwards about how good he felt, how brisk it was. He came to an elementary school in Sarasota, Emma E. Booker Elementary School. The agenda, reading to some students and then talking about education reform. And then all of that agenda, all of that very gentle, sort of low-level domestic agenda building was shattered by a phone call from his national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, informing him of the first jetliner that had crashed into the World Trade Center tower. The president soldiered on, went on with an event to read a book to some of the children who were sitting at his very feet. As he was doing so, his chief of staff, Andrew Card, came in, gave him the grisly news that a second jetliner had crashed into the other tower, the World Trade Center. Then the president hastily got up from that, made an announcement to the country that an apparent act of terrorism had been committed in New York City. Then the shocking, almost paralyzing news that the Pentagon had been hit by yet another jetliner. The president aboarded Air Force One, whisked away from Sarasota, leaving some of his aides behind, sitting in a press room, absolutely as stunned and ashen-faced as all of us, looking at the live pictures, as disbelieving as any set of human beings could be. Jonathan.
Major Garrett in Washington. Carol?
Well, as Major just reported, help is on the way, at least financially, for the city of New York, as well as the recovery efforts in Washington, D.C. CNN's Garrick Utley is here with more on that. $40 billion can buy a lot of help. Garrick.
$40 billion will be very important for the city of New York because the impact, the financial and economic impact of what happened in Lower Manhattan on Tuesday, the scene we see right here, That's going to be very, very heavy, very, very painful, particularly because it comes at a time when the economy here has been slowing as it has been elsewhere across the country. Looking forward to this Friday, of course, as you mentioned, one of the big events will be the visit by President Bush. And what is unusual is that the security measures are understandably very tight. No details from the White House as to where he's going to go, at what time he's going to be there, what his movements are going to be. He's going to come. He will be expected to visit the site down there. He'll attend a prayer service before returning to Washington. As far as the rescue effort is concerned, it was interrupted in the early morning hours because of very heavy rain and electrical storm that moved across Manhattan Island, but the work now has been resumed. Unfortunately, on Thursday, no survivors were found, but the search will continue, of course, through Friday. In New York these days, we're really hearing two kinds of talk on the street, if you will. One, of course, is the grieving, the pain of what happened on Tuesday. The other is what happens now, a very pointed and very important question, which brings us to the name of Osama bin Laden, the name on everyone's lips. Secretary of State Powell has, in effect, fingered bin Laden as the prime suspect. He's the world's most wanted man today. But how much do we really know about him? That is to say, who he is, where he is, and what it is he really wants. The who is the easiest answer. Osama bin Laden is 44, a millionaire born in Saudi Arabia who has used his wealth to finance terror to fulfill his crusade against the United States. The where of bin Laden is mainly Afghanistan, where he built his terrorist camps. The Taliban regime there, which has sheltered bin Laden, has imposed its version and vision of Islam on Afghanistan. Women can work only in health and education fields and have few rights. There is a ban on using the internet and on importing movies, musical instruments, and even playing cards. Western aid workers have been put on trial, charged with the crime of preaching Christianity. In March, the Taliban blew up a pair of 2,000-year-old statues of Buddha, despite international appeals to save the treasures that had no place in the purist Islamic society the Taliban are trying to build. If bin Laden and the Taliban have much in common, bin Laden is more engaged in backing fellow Arabs in their conflict with Israel, which is backed by the United States, and in attacking the leaders of his homeland, Saudi Arabia, whom he sees as the materialistic pawns of a militaristic United States, which has stationed its troops there. And so it is the United States that has become, in Osama bin Laden's eyes, the evil enemy that needs to be cut down in size and power. Literally, brutally cut down. And there's also something else very important that makes Osama bin Laden different from other terrorists. Terrorism usually is used to achieve some tangible goal, land, power, political recognition. Not so with bin Laden. He's not asking the United States for anything. He just wants to inflict pain, pure and simple, for the reasons we just saw. And that's likely to continue until one day, in some way, something is done about him and it. Back to you now in Atlanta.
Garrick, I'm going to tap your years of experience here as a journalist. It's not unheard of for government officials to use the airwaves to send messages to suspects such as Osama bin Laden. How much technology does he have access to? Do you think that he is monitoring the coverage here around the world? And do you think the United States investigators are trying to send a message in order to flush him out?
Very interesting question, because we know that he loves cell phones. He uses cell phones all the time, and I'm sure the intelligence agencies have been trying to intercept those conversations. However, he is in Afghanistan. Now, the official policy there in this purist Islamic state run by the Taliban regime is that satellite dishes are not allowed. People are not allowed to use the internet. They're not supposed to watch television or even movies. There's an import ban on those. So theoretically, or according to the law of Afghanistan, the government there is protecting him, sheltering him. He couldn't hear what's going on here. However, I would well suspect that he has certain privileges, and no doubt he has a satellite dish there, and no doubt he is probably glued to CNN, perhaps even as we speak right now. Carol?
Perhaps. Thank you very much. Garrick Utley reporting live from New York. Well, we were just talking about Osama bin Laden and some strong statements out of Afghanistan this morning. You know, the United States Secretary of State has been the first in the Bush administration to officially point the finger at Osama bin Laden. He is, of course, on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, and the Taliban in Afghanistan is giving him safe haven. CNN's Tom Mantir is across the border in Pakistan's capital, Islamabad. Pakistan obviously might be critical to any sort of retaliation, Tom, but when it does come to any military action, the Taliban is issuing a warning to Americans today.
They actually did issue a warning, Carol, and as Garrick was talking about, the toys, the cell phones, the satellite phones, the internet, things like that, these are all things that the Taliban says they've taken away from Osama bin Laden, that he no longer has access to these tools of his. They've been taken away, according to the Taliban, if you believe what they say. Now, this morning at the Taliban embassy here in Islamabad, a message was sent out from Mullah Omar, and this was a message that they were not involved. They did not have the ability to train pilots in Afghanistan. No pilots from Afghanistan were involved in this operation. They say they condemn terrorism, and they also issued a warning to the United States that they must do a full investigation. They must not just consider Osama bin Laden's reputation in making a decision to strike Afghanistan.
I don't expect the Americans to take such urgent and action without any evidence, because we have condemned this terrorist act, and all the world condemned it as we condemned it. If the Americans attacked Afghanistan without any evidence, it would mean that America is committing terrorism itself.
There have been no indications that the Taliban is ready or willing to hand Osama bin Laden over to authorities, but they have said in private conversations that if credible evidence is provided to Afghanistan and the Taliban, they would consider having him tried in an Islamic country, something that probably would not sit well in the United States. There has been pressure brought against Pakistan, both through the front door and the back door, to cooperate. The president of Pakistan has indicated that full cooperation will be given to the United States on this issue in dealing with its investigation. They will provide some support. Now, one thing that the United States has asked for is the use of Pakistani airspace if a military operation is launched, an air campaign, shall you say, against Afghanistan. This might cause some problems domestically for the Pakistani president, because he is not a politician, he is a military leader, and it could be a real problem domestically if indeed these airstrikes are launched with the implicit cooperation of the Pakistani military government. So there is a lot going on behind the scenes. There has been meetings going on all day by the military here in Pakistan deciding how much probably assistance should be offered to the United States. Carol?
All right, thank you very much. Tom Mantir reporting live from Islamabad, Pakistan. Jonathan, I think you've got some breaking news.
Indeed, we're just into CNN coming from the Reuters news agency from the Pentagon, where apparently in the rubble they have found, amidst the crush of steel and cement, the black boxes of the jet that crashed into the building, killing an estimated 190 people. Authorities have been looking for the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder from that flight, hoping to gain more clues about the people that brought it down and what their intentions were. Now word once again from the Reuters news agency that the black boxes have been found. CNN's Mark Potter is at the Pentagon, and we're expecting to hear from him soon. Carol?
All right, and while we wait for Mark Potter to gather more information on that, I want to pick up the threads from what we were just talking about in terms of Osama bin Laden and what Tom Mantir was saying in terms of how much access he might have, according to the Taliban, to the tools necessary to execute such a terrorist attack. And the next question we want to focus on here is, can the people of Afghanistan be separated from their ruling government's relationship with this known terrorist? We're going to go to Dominic Nutt for some answers. He spent the last 5 weeks in Afghanistan working for a group called Christian Aid, and he joins us this morning from London. Good morning, Dominic. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Good morning.
No problem. What can you tell us about what the people of Afghanistan know about the attack on the United States?
I can tell you that 90% of the people in Afghanistan live in isolated rural villages, and their boundaries are the mountains that surround their communities. They don't have radios, they don't have televisions, they don't have newspapers. They will not have ever even heard of the World Trade Center or even New York. I promise you, these people have no idea what's happened about the victims in America, and I can tell you their hearts will bleed when they find out.
Then what do they know about Osama bin Laden?
I suspect they probably know a little about who he is or what he is, but really it's not something they particularly talk about. They don't even talk about the Taliban. All they're concerned about is that there's been a 3-year drought in Afghanistan. People are down to the last few days of food. When I was leaving, I promise you their biggest concern at the moment is how to keep themselves and their families alive. The graveyards are already filling up in the mountain villages. Their biggest concern now is for the lives of their families.
So what you're saying is they really don't know anything about the relationship between the Taliban and Osama bin Laden. They don't really know what his reputation is, what he's been accused of. There are no standing loyalties to Osama bin Laden amongst the people that you have worked with in Afghanistan.
Well, if I hear you correctly, in the cities, more people will know more about Osama bin Laden. They don't really sympathise with him. They don't sympathise with the Taliban, by and large. They really are a minority sort of regime. But the vast majority of Afghans don't live in the cities. It's a medieval society. Mm-hmm. They really have no form of communication. They will not really know anything about this man. They will have no feelings for him, no comradeship with this man. That is my strong impression.
Thank you, Dominic. Well, then let me ask you this about the Taliban's statement this morning. They say that there are no planes in Afghanistan, there are no places where Osama bin Laden's lieutenants could train pilots, that he or his people, his followers there, have not had access to any kind of communications, satellite phones, cell phones, etc., that it would be impossible for Osama bin Laden to actually execute this sort of planning.
Well, to be honest, my understanding of the Taliban, or my impression of the Taliban, which is not very deep, is that it's a fairly inefficient, shambolic organisation. Whether they really know what they're talking about half the time, I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if this was true. It wouldn't surprise me if it wasn't true. All I know is that it's not a regime. It's not a completely consistent regime. Mm-hmm. It's almost a system of fiefdoms. Isolated organisations, Taliban power areas in one area, less power in another area. Kabul and Herat might not be in communication. One area from another might not be in communication. So really, you take what they say and mm-hmm. you wonder whether they actually know what they're talking about.
But you know what they're also saying, Dominic, is that if there is any sort of military action, a retaliatory strike in Afghanistan, that innocent people will lose their lives, and that any sort of retaliation would only add to the misery of people who live in Afghanistan.
Well, I would agree with that, and I would go further. We've got, according to the UN, when I was there, there's 5.5 million people who are about to suffer, who are about to go over the edge into starvation, and that was when aid agencies were still there, when they were working, and they pulled out yesterday. There's no food getting in, and that is a direct result of this threat of military action. So over and above any bombing and any casualties for bombing, we now have a quarter of the population being held ransom. Now, I understand the reasons why the US and its allies feel that is necessary. But enough innocent civilians have died in America, and we've had messages from Afghanistan expressing the deepest sadness for what's happened. But please, I would say we do not need any more deaths of innocent civilians who know nothing about the plight of American people.
Dominic Nutt with Christian Aid, thank you very much for sharing your perspective. Sometimes it is difficult to separate people from politics. Jonathan?
And we're now in a position to confirm that in an investigation that stretches all the way around the world, some promising progress here in the United States, the discovery and retrieval of the black boxes from the rubble at the Pentagon. CNN's Bob Franken joins us now with more on the story. Bob?
Good morning, John. Pentagon sources confirm that they are about to put out a news release saying that overnight the black boxes, those are the ones that record data and voice information, on the American Airlines 757, which crashed into the Pentagon, causing such a calamity. The black boxes have now been discovered overnight. We had reported yesterday afternoon